Hyperreality. Have you ever had one of those strange moments where you stop and think nothing around me feels real? You're walking through your day, doing normal things, talking to people, maybe scrolling through your phone, and suddenly it hits you. Everything feels hollow, like the world is made of cardboard. Conversations feel rehearsed. Ads are everywhere, even inside people's personalities. You feel like you're watching life more than living it. That feeling is not random. It's not some weird glitch in your brain. It has a name: hyperreality. A French thinker named Jean Baudrillard saw this coming long before the internet took over. He said we were slowly replacing the real world with copies of it. Not just knockoffs or fakes, but simulations that feel more real than the original. He warned that one day we wouldn't be able to tell the difference. And worse, we wouldn't care. Baudrillard wasn't just talking about virtual reality or technology. He was talking about shopping malls, theme parks, news shows, reality TV. He said that in modern culture, we were moving into a new kind of reality, one made of signs, symbols, and media, where everything we see is referencing something else, but nothing is grounded. It's like looking into a mirror that's reflecting another mirror, and on forever. At some point, you lose track of what started it all. Think about this. You watch a video of someone reacting to a reaction of a fake prank on a couple who pretended to break up for views. And you care. You laugh, you judge, you comment. But none of it is real, and your brain doesn't care. Because in a hyperreal world, feeling real is more important than being real. We used to experience the world with our senses: smells, textures, silence, eye contact. Now, our experience is filtered through cameras, captions, and algorithms. You don't eat breakfast to enjoy it. You make it look good enough to post. You don't cry and reflect. You record it from your car so people know you're being raw. Nothing counts unless it's seen. Nothing feels complete unless it's been witnessed. This is the sickness of hyperreality. We are living in simulations of life, not life itself. We have relationships that are more about showing than feeling, experiences that are curated for strangers, thoughts that are packaged into shareable quotes before they even form. Everything is shaped by the question, how does this look? And here's where it gets dark. The more time you spend in hyperreality, the more boring actual reality feels. The real world starts to feel too slow, too quiet, too ugly. So you chase the simulated version. You scroll for dopamine. You chase aesthetics. You want your life to look like the movie version of a life. Your job needs to be fulfilling. Your apartment needs to be vibey. Your personality needs to be brandable. This is why so many people feel fake, numb, or like they're watching themselves from the outside. It's not that you're broken. It's that the world around you has shifted into a performance. And we're all actors now, but no one handed us a script. So we copy what we see, hoping it feels right. Entire industries are built to sell you the idea of being authentic. There are filters to look effortless. There are brands that market honesty. There are influencers whose whole identity is being real. But the moment something becomes a product, it stops being raw. Even rebellion is for sale now. Go off-grid. There's a series for that. Delete social media. There's an app to help. Escape the system. There's a sponsored retreat in Bali for $2,000. Even your desire to unplug is part of the simulation. It's exhausting. But here's the truth. You're not crazy for feeling this way. You're not lazy or disconnected or too sensitive. You are responding like any sane person would when reality has been hijacked. You were born into a culture that handed you a world made of symbols and told you it was real. And when it doesn't feel right, you blame yourself. But you shouldn't. That ache you feel, the craving for something grounded, raw, and unscripted, that is your mind remembering what real feels like. And once you feel that contrast, you can't unsee it. You start noticing the influencer voice, the fake relatability, the viral emotional breakdowns, the endless chain of reactions, likes, edits, and trends. None of it sticks, because your mind knows this is not life. It's just a performance of life. But that realization is powerful. It's not depressing. It's liberating. Because once you see the trap, you can stop running in circles. You can start asking better questions. Like, do I actually want this? Or have I just seen it too many times? You don't need to live like a monk or smash your phone. But you can start finding little pockets of the real. Sitting in silence. Having one good, unrecorded conversation. Watching a sunset without needing to capture it. Feeling something without telling the world. And maybe, just maybe, remembering what it's like to live without being watched. Because when you stop performing, the world starts to feel human again. And in a world built on simulations, being human is the most radical thing you can do. Simulacra script. You know that feeling when you walk into a Disney theme park, and somehow it feels more magical than the actual places it's supposed to represent. When Times Square feels more like New York than quiet residential Brooklyn ever could. When Instagram travel photos make you want to visit places that don't actually look anything like those filtered shots. Welcome to the world of simulacra, and it's completely rewiring how your brain processes reality. Here's what's genuinely disturbing about our current moment. We're living in the first generation in human history where copies have become more influential than originals. Think about this. Most people have stronger emotional reactions to seeing the Hollywood sign than they do to seeing actual mountains. We cry more at movie deaths than we do reading obituaries of real people. We know more about fictional characters than our own neighbors. This isn't just preference. This is your brain literally being rewired to prefer simulation over reality. Jane Baudrillard predicted this back in 1981, but he had no idea how extreme it would become. He described 4 stages of how copies evolve. First, the copy represents reality. Think early photographs. Then the copy hides reality. Think makeup or photo editing. Third, the copy hides the absence of reality. Think social media posts of perfect lives that never existed. And finally, the copy has no relationship to reality at all. It just becomes its own reality. We're deep into stage 4 now, and most people don't even realize it's happened. Your brain doesn't distinguish between simulated experiences and real ones when it comes to emotional impact and memory formation. Neuroscientists have found that people who play violent video games show the same stress hormone patterns as people who witness actual violence. Your amygdala, the part of your brain that processes fear and emotion, responds identically to simulated threats and real ones. This means simulations aren't just influencing how you think, they're literally changing your biochemistry. Look at dating apps. We've created a simulation of human connection that's more addictive than actual human connection. The intermittent reinforcement of matches triggers dopamine releases that are more powerful than face-to-face conversations. People report feeling more excited about getting a match than they do about going on the actual date. The simulation has become more rewarding than the reality it was supposed to facilitate. And here's the kicker. Once your brain gets used to that heightened artificial stimulation, real interactions start feeling boring and inadequate. This is happening everywhere. Food photography has become more important than food taste. Restaurants now hire lighting consultants and food stylists because they know people choose where to eat based on Instagram photos, not reviews of the actual food. The simulation of deliciousness has become more powerful than actual deliciousness. And it gets weirder. Studies show people rate the exact same meal as tasting better when they've seen appealing photos of it first. The simulation is literally changing your sensory experience of reality. Social media has created the most sophisticated simulacra system in human history. Your online persona isn't just a representation of you. For most people, it's become more carefully curated, more emotionally invested, and more socially important than their actual personality. Think about how much time you spend crafting posts versus how much time you spend in unfiltered real-world interactions. The simulation you is getting more attention, more development, more emotional energy than the real you. And here's where it gets psychologically dangerous. Your brain starts to experience cognitive dissonance between your simulated life and your real life. Your Instagram self is confident, successful, always doing interesting things. Your real self is often anxious, uncertain, dealing with mundane problems. Instead of improving your real life to match your standards, you start improving your simulation to cope with the gap. You become more invested in maintaining the copy than developing the original. This creates what psychologists call reality displacement syndrome. You start measuring your real experiences against simulated standards. Real sunsets don't look as good as filtered photos. Real conversations don't feel as witty as your carefully edited posts. Real achievements don't feel as satisfying as viral content. You've trained your brain to prefer artificial stimulation, and reality starts feeling like a downgrade. But the most unsettling part is how this affects your ability to process truth. When simulations become more emotionally compelling than reality, your brain stops using factual accuracy as the primary filter for information. Instead, it prioritizes emotional resonance and narrative coherence. This is why conspiracy theories spread faster than scientific studies. This is why political theater gets more engagement than policy analysis. This is why influencer recommendations carry more weight than expert opinions. We've accidentally created a world where copies are more powerful than originals. Simulations are more engaging than reality, and artificial experiences are more emotionally satisfying than authentic ones. And most people have no idea this cognitive shift has even happened. They just know something feels off about modern life, without realizing they've been living in a hall of mirrors that's slowly replacing their connection to what's actually real. Death of the author script. Remember when you first discovered that your favorite childhood song was actually about something completely different than what you thought? Maybe you sang along to Semi-Charmed Life thinking it was just a fun upbeat tune, only to realize years later it was about crystal meth addiction. Or when you found out Ring Around the Rosie might be about the plague. That moment of cognitive whiplash you felt. That's your first real encounter with one of the most revolutionary ideas in modern thought. The meaning you create from something can be completely independent of what the creator intended. And in our digital age, this concept isn't just academic theory anymore. It's literally reshaping how reality gets constructed. Here's what's actually happening to human communication right now, and it's more radical than most people realize. We've entered an era where audiences have more power over meaning than creators do. Every time someone screenshots a tweet and adds commentary, every time a TikTok sound gets repurposed for something completely different, every time a meme format gets hijacked for political messaging, we're witnessing the death of authorial control in real time. And your brain is rewiring itself to expect this kind of interpretive freedom in everything you encounter. Roland Barthes wrote about the death of the author back in 1967, arguing that once a text is created, the author's intentions become irrelevant. What matters is what the reader brings to it. But Barthes could never have imagined how the Internet would turn this from a literary theory into the fundamental operating system of modern culture. We don't just interpret content differently now. We physically reshape it, remix it, and redistribute it until the original becomes just one version among thousands. Look at what happened to Peep the Frog. Matt Fury created him as a chill, harmless cartoon character saying, "Feels good man" in an indie comic. But once Peep entered the collective consciousness, Fury lost all control over what his creation meant. The Internet transformed Peep into everything from a symbol of Internet culture to a political meme to something associated with hate groups. Fury tried to kill off the character, tried to reclaim it, even took legal action. None of it mattered. The audience had seized control of meaning, and there was no putting that genie back in the bottle. This isn't just happening to memes. It's happening to everything. Politicians discover that their carefully crafted speeches get turned into reaction GIFs that mean the opposite of what they intended. Brands watch their advertisements become jokes that mock the very products they're trying to sell. Musicians find their songs becoming the soundtrack to movements they never signed up for. The traditional relationship between creator and audience has completely flipped. Your brain is adapting to this new reality in fascinating ways. Cognitive scientists have discovered that people who grew up with Internet culture show different neural patterns when processing information. They automatically look for multiple interpretations, expect content to be remixable, and feel comfortable creating meaning without reference to original intent. You've been trained to be an active meaning maker rather than a passive meaning receiver. And this is changing how you process everything from news to relationships to your own identity. But here's where it gets psychologically complex. When everyone becomes an author of meaning, truth becomes incredibly fluid. The same piece of information can simultaneously mean completely different things to different communities, and all of those meanings can feel equally valid to the people holding them. This is why political debates feel so impossible now. People aren't just disagreeing about facts. They're operating from fundamentally different meaning-making systems that turn the same evidence into opposite conclusions. Social media has accelerated this process beyond anything Barthes could have imagined. Every platform is designed to encourage interpretation, remixing, and recontextualization. Twitter's "tweet" function literally builds meaning layering into the architecture. TikTok's "do it" feature makes response and reinterpretation the primary form of content creation. Instagram stories let people add their own context to other people's content. We've built a communication system that assumes the death of authorial control as its default setting, and this is creating something unprecedented in human history. A culture where meaning is permanently unstable, where context collapses so quickly that sincerity and irony become indistinguishable, where the same symbol can mean love to one group and hate to another, sometimes simultaneously. Your brain is trying to navigate a world where semantic stability no longer exists, where every piece of information comes with infinite possible interpretations, and where the original creator's intent has become just one voice in an endless chorus of meaning makers. The most profound shift is happening to your sense of interpretive authority. You've been trained to believe that your reading of something is as valid as anyone else's, including the creator's. This feels liberating, and in many ways it is. But it's also creating a crisis of meaning where shared understanding becomes nearly impossible. When everyone is an author, nobody is an author. When everything can mean anything, maybe nothing means anything at all. Language games. Have you ever noticed how the word literally has completely changed meaning in the last decade? People say things like "I literally died laughing," and everyone understands they mean figuratively, not actually. The word has evolved to mean its exact opposite in casual conversation. But here's what's really wild about this. The dictionary didn't change the language. The language changed the dictionary. Merriam-Webster officially added the figurative definition of literally because that's how people were using it. Reality bent to match how we were playing with words, not the other way around. And this tiny example reveals something massive about how human consciousness actually works. Your brain doesn't just use language to describe reality. Language is actively creating the reality you experience moment by moment. This isn't metaphorical. This is neurologically measurable. When you learn a new word, you literally gain the ability to perceive distinctions that were invisible to you before. Russian speakers, who have separate words for light blue and dark blue, can visually distinguish between those shades faster than English speakers can. Japanese speakers, who have different spatial relationship words, navigate physical space differently than Europeans do. Your vocabulary isn't just reflecting your world. It's constructing your world at the most basic perceptual level. Ludwig Wittgenstein figured this out decades before we had brain imaging technology to prove it. He realized that language isn't a neutral tool for describing pre-existing reality. Instead, language is a series of games with rules that create the reality they claim to describe. Every context, every community, every relationship operates by its own language game with its own internal logic. And here's the crucial part. You can only understand meaning by understanding the game being played. The same words mean completely different things in different games, and most people have no idea which game they're playing at any given moment. Think about the word friend. In real life, it means someone you have a deep personal connection with, someone you trust, someone you spend time with by choice. On Facebook, it means someone whose content appears in your feed. On LinkedIn, it means professional contact. On dating apps, it sometimes means I'm not interested romantically. Same word, completely different games, totally different realities. And your brain has to constantly switch between these different meaning systems without consciously realizing it's happening. But social media has turned language games into something far more complex and psychologically dangerous. We're now playing multiple games simultaneously with overlapping audiences who don't know which game we're playing. When you post something online, some people are interpreting it through the intimacy game, some through the professional game, some through the political game, some through the irony game. You can say the exact same sentence and create completely different realities for different people reading it. This is why online communication feels so exhausting and confusing. Your brain is trying to play multiple language games at once while predicting how other people will interpret your moves within their games. It's like trying to play chess, poker, and charades simultaneously with people who think they're all playing different games entirely. The cognitive load is enormous, and most people handle it by either becoming hyper-careful about everything they say or by giving up on clear communication altogether. The postmodern insight here is that there's no neutral, objective language game. Every way of speaking creates its own version of reality, privileges certain perspectives, and makes other ways of thinking literally unthinkable. Scientific language creates a reality where measurement and replication matter most. Religious language creates a reality where faith and meaning take precedence. Corporate language creates a reality where efficiency and profit become the highest values. You're not just choosing words when you speak. You're choosing which version of reality to reinforce and inhabit. And here's where it gets politically loaded. Whoever controls the dominant language games controls how reality gets constructed for everyone else. When mental health struggles get reframed as chemical imbalances, that creates a reality where pharmaceutical solutions seem natural and obvious. When social problems get described as individual choices, that creates a reality where systemic solutions become invisible. When economic inequality gets discussed as meritocracy, that creates a reality where poverty becomes a moral failing rather than a structural issue. Your brain is constantly being shaped by whichever language games you participate in most frequently. If you spend your time in gaming communities, you start thinking in terms of optimization, strategy, and achievement. If you're deep in therapy culture, everything becomes about emotional processing and boundary setting. If you're immersed in business language, relationships become networking, and life becomes personal branding. You don't just speak these languages. These languages start speaking through you, shaping what you can think and feel and imagine. The most unsettling realization is that you can never step outside language games entirely. There's no neutral position from which to observe reality objectively. You're always inside some game, playing by some rules, creating some version of reality. The question isn't whether language shapes reality. The question is which language games you want to participate in, and what kind of world those games are building around you. End of grand narratives. What if I told you that your grandparents lived in a completely different psychological universe than you do? Not just different technology or different politics, but a fundamentally different relationship to truth itself. They grew up believing that somewhere out there, smart people in institutions had figured out the big questions. That science was steadily revealing how the world works. That democracy was spreading freedom. That economic progress was lifting humanity towards something better. They had what philosophers call grand narratives, overarching stories that made sense of everything and gave life direction and meaning. You live in the wreckage of those stories, and your brain is struggling to navigate a world where no single explanation for reality feels believable anymore. Here's what happened, and it's more devastating than most people realize. Every major institution that used to provide authoritative truth-telling has been caught lying, failing, or serving interests other than truth. Science gave us miracle drugs and also gave us opioid epidemics. Democracy gave us representation and also gave us endless wars fought for corporate profits. Economic progress gave us incredible wealth and also gave us environmental collapse. Religion promised moral guidance and delivered systematic abuse scandals. Higher education promised enlightenment and delivered crushing debt, with questionable career prospects. The media promised objective reporting and delivered clickbait designed to confirm your existing biases. Jean-François Lyotard predicted this collapse back in 1979. He argued that the postmodern condition would be defined by incredulity toward meta-narratives, the big stories that used to hold society together. But even Lyotard couldn't have imagined how completely this would fracture human consciousness. We're not just skeptical of grand narratives anymore. We're living in the first era in human history where multiple contradictory grand narratives exist simultaneously, each with their own evidence, their own experts, their own internal logic, and their own devoted followers. Your brain wasn't designed for this level of narrative chaos. Human consciousness evolved to find patterns, create coherent stories, and use those stories to predict the future and coordinate with other humans. When you can't agree on basic facts about reality with the people around you, your nervous system interprets this as an existential threat. This is why political conversations feel so emotionally intense now. You're not just defending opinions, you're defending your entire framework for making sense of existence. Social media has accelerated this narrative fragmentation beyond anything Lyotard could have imagined. The algorithm doesn't care about truth. It cares about engagement. And what creates the most engagement? Content that confirms your existing narrative while making you feel like that narrative is under attack. Every platform has become a narrative reinforcement machine, feeding you evidence that your version of reality is correct while everyone else has been deceived. You end up living in an information bubble that feels like the whole world, but is actually a tiny slice of possible perspectives. But here's what's really psychologically damaging about this situation. Without shared grand narratives, you lose the ability to have productive disagreements. In the past, people could argue about policies or interpretations while agreeing on basic frameworks. Should we have more government spending or less? That's a debate within a shared narrative about democracy and economics. Now people are arguing about whether democracy is legitimate, whether economics is real, whether experts know anything, whether evidence matters. These aren't policy disagreements. These are ontological wars about the nature of reality itself. The result is something unprecedented in human history. Epistemic learned helplessness. Your brain gets so overwhelmed by contradictory information and competing narratives that it starts shutting down its truth, seeking mechanisms entirely. Instead of trying to figure out what's actually true, you just pick the narrative that feels most emotionally satisfying or socially convenient and stick with it regardless of evidence. Truth becomes a matter of tribal identity rather than investigation and reasoning. And this creates a feedback loop that makes the problem worse. The more people retreat into narrative tribes, the more those narratives diverge from each other. The more they diverge, the harder it becomes to find common ground. The harder it becomes to find common ground, the more people assume that anyone who disagrees with them must be either stupid or evil. Democracy requires the ability to disagree productively. But productive disagreement requires shared assumptions about reality. When those disappear, democracy starts eating itself. Young people feel this most acutely. You're inheriting a world where every adult institution has lost credibility, where every expert has been proven wrong about something important, where every ideology has led to catastrophic unintended consequences. You're supposed to build a life and make important decisions without any reliable framework for distinguishing truth from fiction. No wonder anxiety and depression rates are skyrocketing. You're trying to navigate existence without a map, while being told that all the previous maps were lies anyway. The most unsettling part is that there might not be a way back to grand narratives. Once you've seen how stories about progress and truth and meaning can be used to manipulate and control people, you can't unsee it. Once you've experienced how good it feels to have your biases confirmed and how bad it feels to have them challenged, it becomes almost impossible to seek truth over comfort. We might be permanently stuck in this fragmented state, endlessly fighting wars over reality itself, while the actual world burns down around us. Cultural relativism script. Imagine you're scrolling through social media and you see a video of a cultural practice that makes you physically uncomfortable. Maybe it's arranged marriage. Maybe it's animal sacrifice. Maybe it's corporal punishment in schools. Your immediate gut reaction is probably that this is wrong, that these people need to be educated, that someone should intervene. But then you catch yourself. You remember being told that judging other cultures by your standards is colonial thinking, that different societies have different values, that you need to be respectful of diversity. So you suppress your moral intuition and try to be culturally sensitive instead. That internal conflict you just experienced, that's your brain trying to navigate one of the most psychologically destabilizing ideas of the modern era. The possibility that moral truth doesn't exist at all. Here's what's happening to human moral reasoning right now, and it's more radical than most people understand. We've created the first global civilization in history, where people are expected to simultaneously hold strong moral convictions and believe that all moral convictions are culturally relative. Your brain is trying to process a fundamental contradiction. You're supposed to care deeply about justice while acknowledging that justice means different things to different cultures. You're supposed to fight against oppression while accepting that your definition of oppression might just be cultural bias. You're supposed to have principles while believing that all principles are arbitrary social constructs. Cultural anthropologists started this intellectual revolution with the best intentions. They wanted to combat ethnocentrism, to help people understand that different societies solve human problems in different ways, that Western values aren't necessarily universal truths. Franz Boas and his students documented how concepts like family, justice, beauty, and even basic emotional expressions vary dramatically across cultures. They proved that most of what people assume is natural human behavior is actually learned cultural performance. This was liberating and important work that helped dismantle racist assumptions about cultural superiority. But something unexpected happened when these ideas escaped academic circles and entered popular consciousness. Instead of creating more nuanced understanding of cultural difference, relativism started eating its own foundation. If all moral systems are equally valid, then the moral system that says all moral systems are equally valid is also just one cultural perspective among many. If you can't judge other cultures, then you also can't judge people who do judge other cultures. The whole framework starts collapsing into logical incoherence, but your brain keeps trying to make it work anyway. This creates what psychologists call moral paralysis. When you believe that your deepest moral intuitions might just be cultural programming, you lose confidence in your ability to make ethical judgments at all. Studies show that people exposed to strong relativist arguments become less likely to intervene when they witness harmful behavior, less likely to report unethical conduct, and more likely to rationalize their own moral compromises. When everything is relative, nothing feels worth defending. Social media has turned this philosophical problem into a daily psychological crisis. Every day you're exposed to practices, beliefs, and values from hundreds of different cultural contexts, all mixed together in your feed without any framework for evaluation. Your brain is trying to process honor killings, gender reveal parties, arranged marriages, polyamory, religious fundamentalism, secular humanism, traditional gender roles, and radical gender theory, all as equally valid lifestyle choices. The cognitive dissonance is overwhelming, so most people cope by either becoming rigidly judgmental or completely morally numb. But here's where relativism reveals its most insidious psychological trap. It claims to promote tolerance and understanding, but it actually makes genuine cross-cultural dialogue impossible. If all perspectives are equally valid, then there's no point in trying to convince anyone of anything. If moral disagreements are just cultural differences, then moral reasoning becomes meaningless. You end up with a kind of intellectual segregation where different groups retreat into their own moral universes and stop even trying to find common ground. And this has devastating practical consequences. When international human rights organizations try to address practices like female genital mutilation or child marriage, they get accused of cultural imperialism. When marginalized people within traditional cultures try to advocate for change, they get dismissed as culturally inauthentic. When anyone tries to make universal moral claims about anything, they get shut down as ethnocentric. Relativism, which was supposed to protect vulnerable cultures, ends up protecting harmful practices within those cultures from any possibility of reform or criticism. Your generation is inheriting this moral confusion at the worst possible time. You're facing global challenges that require coordinated moral action: climate change, technological disruption, economic inequality. But you've been taught that moral action itself might be a form of oppression. You care deeply about justice, but you've been told that justice is just a Western concept. You want to make the world better, but you've been convinced that better is a culturally relative judgment. The most disturbing realization is that moral relativism might be self-refuting in practice. Societies that truly embrace it tend to lose the moral confidence necessary to defend themselves against societies that don't. If you really believe that all value systems are equally valid, you have no grounds for resisting value systems that explicitly reject relativism and want to impose themselves on others. Tolerance becomes suicidal when it tolerates intolerance. And at that point, the question isn't whether truth can exist without shared morality. The question is whether anything can exist without the willingness to defend it. Subjectivity over objectivity. Close your eyes for a second and think about the most beautiful place you've ever been. Got it. Now imagine trying to convince someone who hates that exact same place that they're objectively wrong about its beauty. Feels impossible, right? Because beauty isn't in the place. It's in your relationship to the place, your memories, your associations, your neurochemistry in that moment. But here's what's genuinely mind-bending about our current historical moment. We've extended this same logic from aesthetic judgments to literally everything else. Your political beliefs, your moral intuitions, your understanding of science, your interpretation of history, even your perception of basic facts are now treated as subjective experiences rather than claims about objective reality. And this shift is rewiring human consciousness in ways that are both liberating and terrifying. Your brain doesn't actually experience objective reality. This isn't philosophical speculation anymore. This is measurable neuroscience. Everything you think you're perceiving directly is actually being constructed by your nervous system using incomplete information, past experiences, current emotional state, and neurochemical fluctuations. Two people can look at the same event and have genuinely different experiences of what happened because their brains are running different interpretive software. The dress that went viral a few years ago, the one that some people saw as blue and black while others saw as white and gold, wasn't just an optical illusion. It was a perfect demonstration of how subjective all perception actually is. But we've taken this insight and pushed it to an extreme that would have shocked earlier generations. Your great-grandparents lived in a world where people assumed that disagreements were about different opinions regarding the same underlying reality. Democrats and Republicans might have different policies, but they agreed that there were objective economic conditions, measurable social problems, and factual historical events that policies were supposed to address. Now we live in a world where people assume that disagreements are about different subjective realities that have no objective foundation at all. This shift started in academia with postmodern theorists who pointed out that all knowledge is situated knowledge. Your race, gender, class, culture, and historical moment shape what you can see and understand about the world. Scientific objectivity, they argued, was actually just the subjective perspective of white male European academics who had the power to declare their viewpoint universal. This insight was profound and necessary. It revealed how much of what gets labeled as objective truth is actually the perspective of dominant groups presented as neutral fact. But something strange happened when these ideas entered popular culture through social media and therapeutic discourse. Instead of making people more aware of their biases and limitations, subjectivity became a kind of epistemic safe space. Your truth became just as valid as anyone else's truth regardless of evidence, expertise, or logical consistency. Personal experience became the highest form of knowledge. Feelings became facts, and questioning someone's subjective reality became a form of violence rather than a normal part of human reasoning. This creates a psychological environment where your brain stops doing the hard work of distinguishing between perception and reality, between interpretation and fact, between emotional truth and empirical truth. When everything becomes subjective, the cognitive muscles you need for critical thinking start to atrophy. Why wrestle with contradictory evidence when you can just dismiss it as someone else's subjective experience that doesn't apply to your reality? Why change your mind when you can just say that other perspectives are equally valid but not relevant to your personal truth? Social media algorithms have weaponized this epistemic shift in ways that are genuinely dangerous. The platforms don't show you objective reality. They show you personalized reality based on your behavioral patterns, emotional responses, and engagement history. Your feed becomes a mirror that reflects your existing beliefs back to you, while making it feel like you're discovering new information. The algorithm creates a bubble of subjective reality that feels more real and more emotionally satisfying than the messy, contradictory, uncomfortable complexity of actual shared reality. And this is having measurable effects on political discourse and social cohesion. When people believe that their subjective experience is the ultimate authority on truth, democracy becomes impossible. Democratic decision-making requires the ability to weigh evidence, consider multiple perspectives, and sometimes change your mind when presented with better information. But if your reality is just as valid as everyone else's reality, then evidence becomes irrelevant. Experts become just other voices with their own subjective biases, and compromise becomes a betrayal of your authentic truth. The therapeutic revolution has reinforced this subjectivity trap by teaching people that their feelings are always valid and should never be questioned. While this can be healing for people recovering from trauma or abuse, it becomes epistemologically destructive when applied to everything else. Your feelings about climate change, economic policy, or historical events might be understandable and worthy of compassion, but they're not necessarily accurate guides to reality. When emotional validation becomes more important than truth-seeking, critical thinking gets redefined as a form of psychological harm. But here's the most unsettling part of this shift. Pure subjectivity is actually impossible to sustain. You can't live as if everything is just personal opinion when you need to make practical decisions about medicine, engineering, agriculture, or any other domain where reality pushes back. So what actually happens is that people become selectively subjective. They treat their political beliefs as personal truth that can't be questioned, while still expecting their doctor to use objective medical knowledge and their phone to work, according to objective technological principles. We've created a culture of epistemic convenience where people get to be relativistic about uncomfortable truths and absolutistic about comfortable ones. This isn't wisdom about the limits of knowledge. This is intellectual chaos disguised as enlightenment, and it's making shared reality impossible to maintain just when we need it most. Powered knowledge script. Think about the last time you went to a doctor. You walked into that sterile white room, sat in a paper gown that makes you feel vulnerable and exposed, and waited for someone in a lab coat to tell you what's wrong with your body. The entire interaction was designed to establish a power dynamic. The doctor has knowledge, you have ignorance. The doctor asks questions, you provide answers. The doctor makes pronouncements, you follow orders. You probably didn't question their authority because they had the right credentials, the right vocabulary, the right institutional backing. But what if I told you that this whole setup has nothing to do with discovering medical truth and everything to do with maintaining social control? What if the knowledge itself is inseparable from the power structure that produces it? Here's what's actually happening in every expert to layperson interaction, and it's more manipulative than most people realize. Knowledge isn't just information that exists independently waiting to be discovered. Knowledge is a form of power that gets shaped, filtered, and deployed by institutions to maintain their authority and advance their interests. The questions that get researched, the methods that get approved, the conclusions that get published, the treatments that get recommended, all of this is determined not by pure scientific curiosity, but by complex networks of funding, career incentives, regulatory capture, and ideological bias. Michel Foucault spent his career documenting how this power knowledge system operates. He showed how concepts like mental illness, criminal behavior, and sexual deviance weren't discovered by objective science, but were actively constructed by institutions that needed these categories to justify their existence and expand their control. Psychiatry didn't find mental illness in nature. Psychiatry created the concept of mental illness to legitimize its authority over human behavior. The criminal justice system didn't discover criminality. It defined certain behaviors as criminal to maintain social hierarchies and control populations. But Foucault was writing in the 1970s. before the internet completely transformed how power and knowledge interact. Now we're living through the most dramatic shift in information control since the printing press. The traditional gatekeepers, universities, media companies, government agencies, medical institutions, are losing their monopoly on authoritative truth. And they're panicking. The response has been to double down on credentialism, to dismiss alternative sources as misinformation, to pathologize skepticism as conspiracy thinking. But this defensive reaction is actually revealing how much their authority was based on information scarcity rather than superior truth-seeking methods. Your brain is processing this information revolution in real time, and the psychological effects are profound. You're watching institutions that claim to be neutral arbiters of truth reveal themselves as partisan actors with their own agendas. You're seeing expert predictions fail spectacularly while the experts face no consequences for being wrong. You're discovering that peer review often means ideological conformity, that fact-checking means narrative enforcement, that scientific consensus sometimes means manufactured agreement. The cognitive dissonance is overwhelming because you were raised to trust expertise, but expertise keeps betraying that trust. Social media has accidentally created the largest controlled experiment in human history about how power shapes knowledge. Every platform uses algorithms to determine what information you see, in what order, with what context, and with what emotional framing. These algorithms aren't neutral. They're designed to maximize engagement, which means they prioritize content that confirms your existing beliefs while making you feel like those beliefs are under attack. The platforms are literally manufacturing your reality while claiming to simply connect you with information. And the most sophisticated part of this system is that it makes you feel like you're discovering truth independently. When you fall down a rabbit hole of videos or articles that all support the same conclusion, your brain interprets this as converging evidence rather than algorithmic manipulation. When you join online communities of people who share your views, it feels like finding your tribe rather than being sorted into a demographic category for more efficient influence. The power is invisible because it operates through your own sense of agency and discovery. But here's where Foucault's insight becomes genuinely disturbing in our current moment. The institutions that are losing control of information aren't being replaced by better truth-seeking mechanisms. They're being replaced by more diffuse, but equally manipulative systems. Corporate algorithms, influencer marketing, state-sponsored disinformation, and grassroots conspiracy theories are all competing to shape your reality. Instead of one authoritative source of truth, you now have dozens of competing authorities, each with their own power agenda, each claiming to liberate you from the lies of all the others. This creates what scholars call epistemic chaos. Your brain can't process contradictory authoritative claims from multiple sources, all claiming to have special access to suppressed or hidden knowledge. So you end up choosing your preferred power structure rather than evaluating truth claims independently. You don't escape the power knowledge system. You just pick which version of it feels most emotionally satisfying or socially convenient. The pharmaceutical companies that funded studies showing their drugs are safe and effective. The environmental groups that funded studies showing those same drugs are dangerous pollutants. The government agencies that approved the drugs. The independent researchers who challenge the approvals. The journalists who report on the controversy. The fact-checkers who evaluate the journalism. Every single actor in this chain has institutional incentives that shape how they produce, interpret, and disseminate knowledge. There's no neutral observer, no view from nowhere, no knowledge without power. And this leaves you in an impossible position. You need reliable information to make good decisions about your health, your finances, your relationships, your future. But every source of information is embedded in power structures that shape what they can see and what they're motivated to tell you. The question isn't how to find objective truth in a world without power. The question is how to navigate competing power structures when all of them claim to have your best interests at heart while serving interests you can't fully understand. Deconstruction script. Ever notice how the harder you try to define something precisely, the more it starts falling apart? Try explaining what makes a sandwich to someone who's never seen one. Is a hot dog a sandwich? What about a taco? An open-faced sandwich? At what point does a sandwich become a wrap, or a burrito, or just bread with stuff on it? The more you examine the boundaries, the more they blur and shift and contradict themselves. That frustrating moment when you realize that even the simplest concepts resist clear definition. That's your first taste of deconstruction in action. And once you start seeing this pattern, you can't unsee it anywhere. Every structure, every system, every certainty you've ever relied on is quietly undermining itself from the inside, and most people have no idea it's happening. Here's what Jacques Derrida discovered about human thinking, and it's more destabilizing than anything else in philosophy. Every concept only makes sense in relation to what it's not. You can only understand light because you understand darkness. You can only grasp the meaning of good because you contrast it with evil. You can only comprehend presence because you've experienced absence. But here's the twist that breaks everything. Those opposites aren't actually opposite. They're dependent on each other, contaminated by each other, secretly containing each other. Light only exists in degrees of darkness. Good is defined by the evil it excludes. Presence is always haunted by what's absent. The very structure of meaning is built on foundations that collapse under examination. This isn't just word games or academic nitpicking. This is how your brain actually processes reality, and recognizing it changes everything about how you see the world. Take the concept of nature versus culture. Seems obvious, right? Nature is what exists without human interference. Culture is what humans create. But the moment you try to draw that line precisely, it disintegrates. Humans are natural beings whose culture is part of their nature. The foods we eat are natural products that have been culturally modified for thousands of years. The languages we speak use natural vocal cords to produce culturally learned sounds. Even the idea of pure nature is a cultural construct. There's no outside position from which to make this distinction, yet the distinction shapes how you think about everything from environmentalism to technology to your own identity. Social media has turned deconstruction from an abstract philosophical method into a daily psychological experience. Every day you watch concepts that seemed solid and meaningful get pulled apart in real time. Gender binaries dissolve into spectrums. Political categories blur into contradictions. Professional expertise crumbles under scrutiny. Cultural traditions reveal their arbitrary foundations. Your brain is constantly witnessing the deconstruction of structures that used to provide stability and meaning. But instead of philosophical liberation, most people experience this as overwhelming anxiety and confusion. But here's where deconstruction reveals something genuinely disturbing about modern consciousness. The process is irreversible. Once you've seen how a structure undermines itself, you can't go back to naive belief in that structure. Once you've noticed how every binary opposition contains its opposite, you can't stop seeing the contradictions everywhere. Once you've recognized how meaning depends on exclusion and repression, you become hyper-aware of what's being left out of every conversation. It's like developing X-ray vision for intellectual frameworks, and most of the time you'd rather just be able to take things at face value again. This is why deconstructive thinking feels so emotionally exhausting. Your brain craves coherence, stability, and clear boundaries. But deconstruction reveals that coherence is always temporary, stability is always constructed, and boundaries are always porous. You end up living in a state of permanent critical awareness where nothing can be taken for granted, and everything demands constant re-examination. It's intellectually honest, but psychologically brutal, and social institutions are experiencing their own deconstructive crisis. Marriage deconstructs when you examine all the different relationship structures it excludes and includes. Democracy deconstructs when you trace how it depends on the very exclusions it claims to overcome. Capitalism deconstructs when you follow how it requires the non-market relationships it pretends to replace. Education deconstructs when you see how it reproduces the hierarchies it claims to challenge. Every system reveals its internal contradictions when subjected to sustained analysis, but society requires these systems to function even though they can't bear close scrutiny. The most disorienting part is that deconstruction doesn't offer alternatives. It's not trying to replace bad structures with good ones. It's showing you that all structures have the same internal instability, the same dependence on what they exclude, the same tendency to undermine their own foundations. Traditional philosophy wanted to build better systems of thought. Deconstruction shows you why all systems of thought are doomed to failure while being simultaneously necessary for human functioning. This leaves you in a permanent state of intellectual vertigo. You can't believe in structures naively anymore, but you can't live without them either. You can see through the arbitrary nature of social categories, but you still have to navigate a world organized by those categories. You understand that meaning is always unstable and provisional, but you still need meaning to make decisions and build relationships and create anything worthwhile. The ultimate deconstructive insight is that this instability isn't a problem to be solved. It's the fundamental condition of human existence. We are beings who create structures that we then discover are inadequate, who build meanings that we then find are incomplete, who establish identities that we then realize are contradictory. The chaos isn't hidden inside the structure. The structure is a temporary arrangement of chaos that pretends to be permanent while constantly revealing its own impossibility. Liquid modernity. Have you ever wondered why your parents seem so confused by modern life? Why they can't understand how you change jobs every few years? Why they're baffled by your dating patterns? Why they keep asking when you're going to settle down, as if settling down is still something people do? They grew up in what sociologists call solid modernity, where institutions were built to last, where careers were supposed to be lifelong, where communities stayed together for generations, where identities were supposed to remain stable from adolescence to death. You're living in liquid modernity, where everything that used to be solid has melted into fluid, temporary, constantly shifting arrangements, and your brain is struggling to adapt to a world where nothing stays the same long enough to feel real or reliable. Zygmunt Bauman coined the term liquid modernity to describe what's happened to human society over the past few decades. But even he couldn't have predicted how completely liquid everything would become. He was thinking about job security disappearing and traditional family structures breaking down. He couldn't have imagined a world where your entire social network could evaporate when a platform gets shut down, where your professional reputation depends on algorithmic visibility, where your romantic relationships begin and end through swipe mechanics, where your political beliefs get reshaped by whatever content you consumed this week. Your nervous system wasn't designed for this level of constant flux. Human psychology evolved in small, stable communities where social roles, relationship patterns, and survival strategies remained consistent across generations. Your brain expects to be able to learn the rules of reality once and then operate according to those rules for the rest of your life. But now the rules change faster than you can learn them. The job market that existed when you started college doesn't exist when you graduate. The social media platform where you built your identity gets replaced by something completely different. The neighborhood you grew up in gets gentrified beyond recognition. The cultural values you were raised with become outdated moral positions within a decade. This creates what psychologists call continuous partial adaptation. Instead of fully adapting to a stable environment, your brain is constantly trying to adapt to environments that keep changing before the adaptation is complete. You're always slightly behind, always slightly disoriented, always slightly anxious because the ground keeps shifting beneath your feet. Your emotional regulation systems never get a chance to calibrate because the stimuli keep changing. Your identity formation never gets a chance to solidify because the social categories keep evolving. But here's what's really psychologically devastating about liquid modernity. The institutions that used to provide stability and meaning, marriage, career, religion, community, political parties, have all become consumer choices rather than life structures. You don't join a religion. You shop for spiritual practices. You don't commit to a career. You build a personal brand. You don't find your people. You curate your network. You don't inherit a political identity. You perform one that matches your current lifestyle. Everything that used to anchor human identity has become temporary, optional, and endlessly customizable. Social media has accelerated this liquefaction beyond anything Bauman imagined. Your online identity can shift with every post. Your social connections can form and dissolve based on algorithmic recommendations. Your interests and opinions can be shaped by whatever content gets served to you that day. You're not building a stable self anymore. You're constantly updating a fluid self that responds to real-time feedback from digital environments that are themselves constantly changing. And this creates a feedback loop that makes everything more liquid. When everyone's identity is fluid, traditional institutions can't maintain their solid structures. When businesses can't predict what consumers will want next year, they can't make long-term investments. When employees change companies every few years, companies can't invest in training or loyalty programs. When romantic relationships are viewed as temporary arrangements, people don't develop the skills needed for long-term partnership. When political coalitions are based on momentary shared interests rather than deep ideological commitments, democratic institutions become unable to govern effectively. The result is what Bauman called the individualization of risk. In solid modernity, institutions absorbed risk. If you got sick, your community took care of you. If you lost your job, There were social safety nets. If you needed education or training, institutions provided it. Now every risk has been shifted onto individual shoulders. You're responsible for your own health care, your own job security, your own retirement, your own education, your own emotional well-being. But you're trying to manage these risks in a liquid environment where all the traditional risk management strategies have stopped working. Young people feel this most acutely. You're told to follow your passion, but passions change. You're told to build your network, but networks are temporary. You're told to invest in yourself, but you don't know what version of yourself will be marketable in 5 years. You're told to be authentic, but authenticity is now a performance category. You're supposed to be flexible and adaptable, but flexibility and adaptability are exactly what make it impossible to build anything solid or lasting. The most unsettling part is that liquid modernity might be irreversible. Once institutions become fluid, they can't easily become solid again. Once identities become customizable, they resist being fixed. Once social relationships become optional and temporary, they lose the binding power that made them meaningful. We might be permanently stuck in this state of constant flux, always adapting but never arriving, always becoming but never being, always connected but never belonging, surfing endless waves of change without ever reaching solid ground. Panopticism. Stop reading for a second and think about the last controversial thought you had but didn't post online. Maybe it was a political opinion that might offend someone. Maybe it was a personal confession that felt too vulnerable. Maybe it was just an honest reaction to something that you knew wouldn't play well with your audience. Now ask yourself this: who exactly were you afraid would see it? Your boss, your family, random strangers, future employers. The truth is, you probably couldn't name a specific person. You were afraid of everyone and no one at the same time. You censored yourself because you felt watched, even though you had no evidence that anyone was actually watching. That invisible pressure you felt, that's the most sophisticated form of social control ever created, and it's rewiring your brain in ways that would terrify the totalitarian regimes of the past. Here's what's happening to your consciousness right now, and it's more dystopian than most people realize. You're living inside a digital panopticon, a system where you modify your behavior not because you're being watched, but because you might be being watched. The original panopticon was Jeremy Bentham's design for a prison where guards could observe all prisoners without the prisoners knowing whether they were being observed. The psychological effect was that prisoners would behave as if they were always being watched, even when they weren't. Foucault realized this was the perfect metaphor for how modern power operates. Control doesn't require constant surveillance. It just requires the possibility of surveillance internalized as self-discipline. Social media has turned this abstract concept into your daily reality. Every time you post something, there's a permanent record that could be accessed by anyone, anytime, for any reason. Your future employer might see it. Your current relationships might be damaged by it. Your political enemies might use it against you. Your family might judge you for it. The algorithm might punish you by reducing your reach. The platform might suspend your account. These aren't paranoid fantasies. These are documented things that happen to real people every day. So your brain learns to preemptively edit everything you want to say through multiple imaginary audiences simultaneously. But here's what's genuinely disturbing about this process. The self-censorship becomes automatic and unconscious. You don't consciously think about what you can and cannot say anymore. Your brain just stops generating thoughts that feel socially risky. You start thinking in pre-approved language without realizing it. You begin to genuinely believe that your carefully curated thoughts are your authentic thoughts. The Panopticon doesn't just change your behavior. It changes your inner monologue, your emotional responses, your spontaneous reactions. You internalize the surveillance so completely that you become your own prison guard without recognizing the transformation. And this is affecting entire generations in ways we're only beginning to understand. Young people who grew up with social media show different patterns of risk-taking, different approaches to privacy, different relationships to authenticity than previous generations. They're more careful, more strategic, more aware of their image, but also more anxious, more performative, more disconnected from their own unfiltered responses to life. They've learned to live as if they're always on stage, always being recorded, always accountable to invisible audiences with unknown standards. The platforms themselves have made this surveillance system incredibly sophisticated, while keeping it mostly invisible. The algorithm tracks everything. What you click on, how long you pause on different posts, what you type and then delete without posting, who you interact with, when you're most active, what emotions your content generates in other users. This data gets fed into psychological profiles that are more accurate than what you know about yourself. Companies can predict your behavior, influence your decisions, and modify your beliefs with precision that would make propaganda ministers weep with envy. But the most insidious part is how this system makes surveillance feel like freedom. You chose to create these accounts. You voluntarily share this information. You could leave anytime you want. The cage is invisible because it's built out of your own desires for connection, validation, and social participation. You censor yourself not because you're being forced to, but because self-censorship has become the price of digital citizenship. And most people pay this price without consciously recognizing what they're giving up. This creates what scholars call anticipatory conformity. You don't wait to be punished for saying the wrong thing. You proactively avoid saying anything that might be wrong according to shifting and unpredictable social standards. You become hypervigilant about tone, context, and potential misinterpretation. You start crafting your authentic self-expression to match what you think will be rewarded by the algorithm and accepted by your imagined audience. Spontaneity dies. Honesty becomes strategic. Truth-telling becomes a calculated risk assessment. And the really terrifying part is that this behavioral modification is spreading beyond digital spaces. People report self-censoring in private conversations because they've internalized the feeling of being potentially recorded or reported. They edit their thoughts in personal journals because they worry about digital privacy. They modify their behavior in their own homes because smart devices might be listening. The Panopticon has escaped the screen and colonized consciousness itself. The ultimate horror of digital panopticism is that it's invisible to the people living inside it. You feel like you're expressing yourself freely while unconsciously restricting your expression to safe, approved patterns. You think you're connecting authentically with others while managing your presentation according to algorithmic optimization. You believe you're exercising choice while being systematically shaped by systems designed to predict and control your behavior. The prison guards have become unnecessary because you've learned to imprison yourself. And the most effective part of the system is that you don't even know the bars are there. Post-truth. Remember when you first realized that two people could watch the same video and come away with completely different understandings of what happened. Maybe it was a protest, maybe it was a sports play, maybe it was a political speech. You watched person A describe what they saw, then person B described the exact opposite, and you felt that sinking realization that objective reality might not exist the way you thought it did. But here's what's really happening in that moment, and it's more profound than simple disagreement. You're witnessing the collapse of the entire framework that Western civilization used to distinguish between truth and opinion, between fact and interpretation, between what happened and how people feel about what happened. We've entered what philosophers call the post-truth era, where emotional resonance has become more powerful than empirical evidence, and most people don't even realize their brains have rewired themselves to prioritize feelings over facts. Here's the psychological shift that's breaking human society right now. For centuries, people disagreed about what facts meant, but they generally agreed that facts existed independently of their feelings about those facts. You might interpret a historical event differently than someone else, but you both accepted that the event actually happened in some specific way that could theoretically be determined through investigation. You might have different political opinions, but you acknowledged that there were measurable economic conditions, demographic trends, and policy outcomes that your opinions were supposed to address. Now we live in a world where people don't just disagree about what facts mean. They disagree about whether facts matter at all when those facts contradict their emotional truth. This isn't happening because people have gotten stupider or more irrational. This is happening because information technology has fundamentally changed how your brain processes truth claims. In a pre-digital world, most of your information came from a limited number of sources that had institutional incentives to maintain credibility over time. Newspapers, television networks, and academic institutions could be biased, but they couldn't afford to be completely wrong about basic facts because their reputation depended on some relationship to reality. Now most of your information comes from sources that are optimizing for immediate engagement rather than long-term credibility. And what maximizes engagement? Content that makes you feel something intense, regardless of whether it's factually accurate. Social media algorithms have discovered that your brain responds more strongly to information that confirms your existing beliefs, while making you feel like those beliefs are under attack. This creates a neurochemical reward cycle that's more addictive than cocaine. When you see a post that validates your worldview while demonizing people who disagree with you, your brain releases dopamine, reduces cortisol, and strengthens the neural pathways associated with that particular interpretation of reality. When you encounter information that contradicts your beliefs, your brain interprets this as a literal threat and activates fight or flight responses that make rational evaluation almost impossible. But the most insidious part of the post-truth condition is how it's changed the social function of information sharing. People used to share information primarily to inform others about what they believed to be true. Now people share information primarily to signal their tribal identity and emotional state. The accuracy of the information becomes secondary to its social utility. Sharing a false but emotionally resonant story about political opponents serves the same social function as sharing accurate but emotionally neutral data. In fact, False information often works better for social bonding because it requires more faith and loyalty to believe. This has created something unprecedented in human history: parallel information ecosystems that don't just disagree about interpretations of shared facts, but that generate completely different sets of supposed facts tailored to different emotional and political needs. Climate change activists and climate change deniers aren't just interpreting the same scientific data differently. They're operating from entirely different data sets, different methodologies, different definitions of what counts as evidence. Both sides can produce experts, studies, and statistics that support their position. Both sides can point to institutional bias and conflicts of interest in the other side's sources, and your brain has no reliable way to adjudicate between these competing claims because the post-truth condition has undermined the very concept of neutral expertise. Every expert can be dismissed as biased. Every institution can be accused of having ulterior motives. Every study can be countered with another study that reaches the opposite conclusion. The traditional epistemological authorities that people used to rely on to settle factual disputes have lost their credibility, but nothing has replaced them except tribal loyalty and emotional preference. This is having measurable effects on democratic governance and social cohesion. Democracy requires the ability to have productive disagreements about policy within a shared framework of factual reality. But when people can't agree on basic facts about economics, public health, history, or science, democratic debate becomes impossible. Instead of arguing about what policies would best address shared problems, people argue about whether the problems exist at all. Instead of evaluating competing solutions, people retreat into epistemological bubbles where their preferred solutions are the only ones that make sense. Young people are inheriting this post-truth landscape without the cognitive tools to navigate it effectively. You've been raised in an environment where every truth claim comes with counterclaims, where every authority has been debunked by some other authority, where every piece of evidence has been disputed by some expert somewhere. You're supposed to be informed citizens and critical thinkers, but you're trying to think critically in an information environment designed to make critical thinking impossible. The most disturbing aspect of post-truth culture is that it might be self-reinforcing. Once people lose faith in the concept of objective truth, they stop doing the cognitive work required to distinguish between accurate and inaccurate information. Once emotional resonance becomes the primary criterion for belief, rational evaluation atrophies like an unused muscle. Once tribal loyalty becomes more important than factual accuracy, society loses the shared epistemological foundation necessary for collective problem solving. We might be witnessing the end of truth as an organizing principle for human civilization, replaced by competing mythologies that feel more satisfying than reality, but leave us unable to address the actual challenges threatening our survival. The spectacle? Picture this. You're at a concert, but instead of watching the performance, you're watching hundreds of people holding up phones, recording the performance they're not actually experiencing because they're too busy documenting it for people who aren't there. You're witnessing something that would have been incomprehensible to previous generations. A crowd of people who traveled to see something live, paying money to watch it through screens while creating content for other screens. The performance has become secondary to the performance of experiencing the performance, and that moment of cognitive vertigo you feel when you realize what's happening. That's your brain recognizing that you're living inside what Guy Debord called the society of the spectacle, where image has completely separated from reality and taken on a life of its own. Here's what's actually happened to human experience, and it's more radical than most people comprehend. You don't live in reality anymore. You live in a mediated simulation of reality that's more compelling, more emotionally satisfying, and more socially important than actual reality. Your relationships exist primarily through social media performances. Your political engagement consists mainly of consuming and sharing symbolic content. Your consumer choices are based on brand narratives rather than product utility. Your self-image depends more on your online presentation than your offline character. Even your private experiences get filtered through the lens of how they might be shared, displayed, or documented for an imaginary audience. Debord was writing in 1967, when television was the dominant medium and consumer culture was just beginning to colonize consciousness. He predicted that advanced capitalism would eventually transform all of life into a spectacle, where authentic experience would be replaced by the consumption of images about experience. But even his most paranoid vision couldn't have anticipated how completely the spectacle would penetrate everyday existence. You don't just consume media, you are media. Your life has become content, your relationships have become performances, and your identity has become a brand that requires constant management and optimization. The psychological effects of living inside the spectacle are profound and largely unconscious. Your brain starts to evaluate experiences based on their potential as content rather than their intrinsic value. You choose restaurants because they're photogenic. You plan vacations around Instagram opportunities. You attend events to be seen attending rather than to participate meaningfully. You develop relationships that look good online regardless of how they actually feel offline. The spectacle doesn't just distract you from authentic experience. It rewires your reward system so that simulated experience becomes more satisfying than authentic experience. Social media has transformed every individual into their own personal television network, complete with programming, advertising, audience development, and ratings anxiety. You're simultaneously the star, the director, the editor, and the audience of your own ongoing reality show. But here's what's genuinely disturbing about this transformation. The performance becomes so consuming that you lose touch with what exists outside the performance. Your offline self starts to feel incomplete, unprofessional, insufficiently optimized. Reality begins to feel like a rough draft of your online presentation rather than the other way around. And this creates what Debord called the separation. You become separated from your own experiences because you're constantly thinking about how to represent those experiences to others. You become separated from other people because you're relating to their representations rather than their actual selves. You become separated from society because you're engaging with symbolic politics rather than material conditions. You become separated from yourself because your identity becomes a performance that you have to maintain rather than something you simply are. But the most insidious aspect of the spectacle is how it makes this separation feel like connection. When you get likes and comments on your posts, your brain interprets this as social bonding, even though you're actually alone staring at a screen. When you consume political content that makes you feel informed and engaged, your brain experiences this as civic participation, even though you're not actually participating in anything. When you watch lifestyle content about experiences you can't afford, Your brain gets some of the satisfaction of having those experiences without actually having them. The spectacle has also colonized activism and resistance movements. Social justice becomes a performance of having the right opinions, rather than doing the work of creating change. Environmental consciousness becomes a matter of buying the right products and posting the right content rather than actually reducing consumption. Political engagement becomes sharing outrage about injustices rather than organizing to address them. The spectacle absorbs and neutralizes opposition by turning it into entertainment that provides emotional catharsis without requiring behavioral change. Corporate capitalism has learned to exploit this perfectly. Brands don't just sell products anymore. They sell identity performance opportunities. You don't buy clothes. You buy the ability to perform a certain kind of person. You don't choose restaurants. You choose stages for lifestyle performance. You don't select entertainment. You curate content that reflects your sophisticated taste to an imaginary audience that's constantly judging your choices. Consumption becomes a form of self-expression, but the self being expressed is increasingly disconnected from any authentic interior experience. Young people feel this most intensely because you've never known a world without the spectacle. Your formative experiences happened inside social media platforms designed to turn everything into performance. You learned to think about yourselves as brands before you developed stable identities. You practiced relationships through screens before learning how to be intimate in person. You consumed political content before understanding how political systems actually operate. The spectacle isn't something that happened to you. It's the environment you developed in, like fish who don't know they're wet because they've never experienced air. The ultimate tragedy of the society of the spectacle is that it promises authentic experience while systematically destroying the possibility of authenticity. You're told to be yourself while being given endless tools for self-optimization and image management. You're encouraged to live your truth while being surrounded by platforms that reward performance over honesty. You're promised connection while being trapped in isolation with screens. The spectacle offers everything you think you want while making it impossible to actually want anything real, because you've lost touch with what real means when everything has become representation. Decentering the self, Sarah wakes up at 7 a.m. and checks her phone. She scrolls through LinkedIn, where she sees herself as the ambitious marketing professional. Then Instagram, where she curates her wellness journey complete with yoga poses and green smoothies. By 8:30, she is arguing with her mother over text about not calling enough, where suddenly she feels like a guilty daughter. At work, she becomes the collaborative team player. During lunch, she transforms into the political activist sharing stories about climate change. By evening, she is the devoted girlfriend cooking dinner for her partner. Before bed, she opens TikTok and finds herself relating to 20 different personality types and mental health symptoms. Which one is the real Sarah? Here is what your brain just did. It tried to find the core Sarah, the authentic version underneath all those roles, the real identity that exists somewhere deep inside waiting to be discovered. But what if I told you that this entire way of thinking about yourself is completely wrong? What if there is no core Sarah at all? This idea terrifies most people because we have been raised on the myth of the unified self. We believe somewhere inside us lives our true identity just waiting to be found. We spend thousands of dollars on therapy trying to discover who we really are. We take personality tests hoping they will reveal our authentic nature. We have midlife crises wondering if we have been living someone else's life. But postmodern thinkers discovered something that changes everything about how we understand ourselves. There is no fixed self to discover. Michel Foucault spent decades studying how identities are created, and he found something shocking. The self is not something you discover. It is something that gets constructed through power structures and social practices. Every time you fill out a form that asks for your race, your gender, your sexual orientation, you are not describing some pre-existing truth about yourself. You are participating in a system that creates these categories and forces you into them. Think about how different you act around your parents versus your friends, versus your boss versus strangers on the internet. Most people explain this by saying they are showing different sides of their personality. But what if those are not sides of some deeper unified you? What if those are just different selves that exist in different contexts? What if the you that exists at work is just as real as the you that exists at home? This is not some abstract philosophical idea. Neuroscience is backing this up. When researchers scan people's brains while they think about themselves in different relationships and contexts, they find that completely different neural networks activate. The brain literally creates different versions of you for different situations. There is no central command center where the real you lives. Instead, your brain generates multiple selves as needed. But here is where it gets really interesting. These different selves are not just personal choices. They are shaped by what Foucault called discourse. Discourse is basically the invisible rule book that society uses to determine what counts as normal or acceptable. When you say you are an introvert, you are not describing some natural fact about your biology. You are using a category that was invented by psychologists in the 20th century and has now become so common that we think it describes something real and permanent about who people are. The same thing happens with gender identity, sexual orientation, career choices, even mental health diagnoses. These categories feel natural to us, but they are actually historical inventions that shape how we think about ourselves. 100 years ago, the category of heterosexual did not exist. People had different sexual practices, but they did not organize their entire identity around who they were attracted to. Now we cannot imagine understanding ourselves without these labels. This is why modern life feels so chaotic and confusing. We are constantly being asked to define ourselves using categories that are constantly shifting. Social media amplifies this by giving us endless opportunities to perform different versions of ourselves. Dating apps reduce us to a handful of photos and interests. Professional networks turn us into lists of skills and achievements. Each platform demands a different version of who we are. And here is the really wild part. The more we try to find our authentic self, the more we get trapped in this system. Every attempt to discover who we really are just leads us to more categories, more labels, more ways of defining ourselves that were created by someone else. The whole idea of authenticity becomes just another way that power structures control how we think about ourselves. This does not mean you are powerless or that nothing about you matters. But it does mean that the question, who am I, is the wrong question. The better question is, how am I being constructed and by whom? When you stop trying to discover your true self and start examining how your sense of self gets created, you suddenly see all the invisible forces that have been shaping your identity without you realizing it. Most people find this idea either liberating or absolutely terrifying. Once you realize there is no essential you to discover, you can start making more conscious choices about which version of yourself you want to create in different contexts. You can stop feeling guilty about being different with different people. You can stop searching for some perfect, authentic self that does not exist. But you also have to face the reality that much of what you think of as your personality, your preferences, your beliefs about who you are might be more constructed and less natural than you ever imagined. The collapse of meaning. Your friend posts a picture of their breakfast with the caption, "Living my best life," and you immediately know they are being ironic. But then you realize they might actually mean it. Or maybe they are being ironic about being ironic. Or perhaps they are genuinely happy about their avocado toast, but using irony to protect themselves from seeming too earnest. You stare at this simple Instagram post for 30 seconds trying to decode what they actually mean, and then you give up and just double tap the heart. Welcome to the death of straightforward communication. We live in a world where saying something directly feels almost embarrassing. Everything has to be filtered through layers of irony, sarcasm, and self-awareness. Politicians speak in calculated sound bites that mean nothing. Advertisers sell products by pretending not to sell products. Even our entertainment is mostly references to other entertainment. When was the last time you encountered something that was just what it appeared to be without any hidden meaning or cultural commentary? This is not an accident. This is the logical endpoint of what postmodern philosophers predicted would happen when all our traditional sources of meaning collapsed. For most of human history, people knew what things meant. God was real. Your country was worth dying for. Hard work led to success. Love conquered all. These were not just beliefs, they were the foundation that made life make sense. Even if you disagreed with some of these ideas, you still lived in a culture where most people shared basic assumptions about what mattered and why. But starting in the 20th century, these certainties began crumbling. 2 world wars showed that civilized nations could commit unimaginable atrocities. Science revealed that humans were not the center of the universe. Psychology demonstrated that our rational minds were driven by unconscious desires we barely understood. Economics proved that hard work did not guarantee success, and that the system was rigged in favor of those who already had power. Jean Baudrillard saw this coming, and he described what would happen next. When people lose faith in grand narratives and ultimate truths, they do not just find new meanings to believe in. Instead, meaning itself becomes a game. Everything becomes a simulation of meaning rather than actual meaning. We end up living in what he called hyperreality, where the copy becomes more real than the original. Think about how this plays out in your daily life. You do not just buy clothes, you buy the lifestyle that the brand represents. You do not just eat food, you curate an aesthetic around your dining choices. You do not just have relationships, you perform relationship goals on social media. Every genuine human experience gets turned into content that references other content, until nobody remembers what any of it was originally supposed to mean. This creates a weird psychological state that researchers are just beginning to understand. When everything is potentially ironic, your brain has to work overtime trying to decode what people actually mean. Studies show that constant exposure to ironic communication triggers the same stress response as being in a genuinely confusing social situation. Your nervous system cannot tell the difference between playful ambiguity and actual social threat. But here is the really disturbing part. Once irony becomes the default mode of communication, it becomes almost impossible to express genuine emotion or belief without feeling vulnerable or naive. Try posting something earnest and heartfelt on social media without any protective layer of humor or self-deprecation. It feels terrifying because you know some people will assume you are being ironic and others will judge you for being too sincere. This is why young people especially struggle with what psychologists call emotional authenticity. They have grown up in a culture where being genuine feels risky and being ironic feels safe. But constant irony creates a prison. You cannot connect deeply with others if you are always hiding behind layers of meaning. You cannot even connect with yourself if you are never sure when your own thoughts and feelings are genuine versus performed. The collapse of meaning also explains why conspiracy theories and extreme ideologies are so appealing right now. When mainstream culture offers nothing but ironic detachment and simulation, some people desperately crave something that feels absolutely true and unquestionably real. The more everything else becomes a game, the more attractive it becomes to find a belief system that claims to reveal the ultimate truth about reality. But this creates a vicious cycle. The people who retreat into rigid ideologies push everyone else even further into ironic detachment. And the more detached and ironic mainstream culture becomes, the more it drives people toward extremes. We end up polarized between those who believe everything is meaningless and those who cling to meaning so tightly they cannot question it. Meanwhile, most people exist in this strange middle space where they cannot commit fully to either earnestness or irony. They post memes about being depressed, but are not sure if they are actually depressed or just performing depression because it is culturally expected. They say they care about social causes, but wonder if their activism is genuine or just virtue signaling. They claim to love their partner, but question whether their feelings are real or just following a script they learned from movies and songs. This is not a personal failing. This is what happens when an entire culture loses its shared foundation for what counts as meaningful. When everything can be deconstructed and nothing can be taken at face value, people become afraid to mean anything definitively. The strangest part is that recognizing this problem does not solve it. Even talking about the collapse of meaning becomes another layer of ironic commentary. Even genuine attempts to restore authentic communication get absorbed back into the system of simulation and reference. We are trapped in a hall of mirrors where every attempt to find the exit just creates another reflection. The fragmented self. You have 17 different versions of yourself online, and you do not even realize it. There is LinkedIn you, who speaks in corporate buzzwords and celebrates synergy. Instagram you, who only posts when the lighting is perfect and life looks effortlessly beautiful. Twitter you, who has strong opinions about everything and argues with strangers. Reddit you, who knows obscure facts and makes clever references. Discord you, who uses completely different humor and vocabulary. TikTok you, who performs for an algorithm that rewards whatever gets attention. Then there is text message you, who is different with your mom versus your boss versus your college friends versus that person you are dating. WhatsApp you. Snapchat you. Dating app you, where you have carefully curated 5 photos that supposedly represent your entire personality. Even email you changes depending on whether you are writing to a professor or a customer service representative or your landlord. Each platform demands a different performance, and after a while you start to forget which one is supposed to be the real you. This is not just about social media etiquette or personal branding. This is about something much more fundamental. Social media has weaponized a process that postmodern philosophers warned would destroy the coherent self. Every platform fragments your identity into smaller and smaller pieces until there is nothing left holding them together. Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari called this process becoming molecular. They predicted that modern technology would break down the unified subject into what they called assemblages. Basically, your sense of self would stop being one coherent thing and instead become a collection of temporary connections and flows that change depending on the situation. They thought this might be liberating. They were wrong about the liberating part. Here is what actually happens to your brain when you constantly switch between different online identities. Neuroscientists have found that maintaining multiple self-presentations creates something called cognitive load. Your prefrontal cortex has to work overtime keeping track of which version of yourself you are supposed to be in each context. This is why scrolling through social media is so mentally exhausting even when you are not doing anything productive. Your brain is constantly switching between different modes of being. But the real problem is not just mental fatigue. The real problem is that this constant switching prevents you from developing what psychologists call identity consolidation. Normally, during adolescence and young adulthood, people go through a process where all their different experiences and roles get integrated into a relatively stable sense of who they are. But when you are constantly performing different versions of yourself for different audiences, this integration never happens. You get stuck in what researchers call identity diffusion. And here is where it gets really disturbing. The platforms are designed to keep you fragmented because fragmented users are more profitable. When you have a stable, integrated sense of self, you know what you want, and you are harder to manipulate. But when your identity is scattered across multiple platforms, each optimized for different kinds of engagement, you become much more susceptible to advertising and algorithmic manipulation. Think about how different products get marketed to your different online selves. LinkedIn shows you productivity tools and career development courses. Instagram advertises skincare and lifestyle products. TikTok pushes whatever weird thing the algorithm thinks will keep you scrolling. Each platform has learned to target a different fragment of your identity, and none of them care whether these fragments actually fit together into a coherent whole. This is why so many people report feeling like they do not know who they really are anymore. It is not because they have not done enough soul searching or self-reflection. It is because their sense of self is being systematically fragmented by technologies that profit from keeping them in pieces. Every time you adapt your personality to fit a platform's culture, you are training yourself to be more fragmented. The worst part is that this fragmentation becomes addictive. When you do not have a strong, integrated sense of self, you become dependent on external validation to know how you are doing. You start measuring your worth by likes and comments and shares. But since each platform rewards different aspects of your personality, you need to keep checking multiple platforms to get a complete sense of how you are performing. This creates what researchers call validation loops, where you need constant feedback from multiple sources to feel okay about yourself. Meanwhile, your offline relationships suffer because you have gotten so used to performing curated versions of yourself that genuine, unfiltered interaction starts to feel uncomfortable. You find yourself thinking in terms of how experiences would look on social media instead of just experiencing them directly. You start to feel like the unmediated version of yourself is boring or not worth sharing. Some people try to solve this by going on digital detoxes or deleting social media entirely. But this misses the deeper point. The problem is not just the technology itself. The problem is that we are living in a culture that has lost the social structures that used to help people develop integrated identities. Extended families, neighborhoods, religious communities, stable careers, long-term relationships. These used to provide consistent contexts where you could develop a relatively coherent sense of who you were over time. Now most people move frequently, change jobs every few years, maintain relationships primarily through screens, and have very little connection to institutions that persist across decades. Without these stabilizing forces, social media fragmentation becomes almost inevitable. The platforms are not creating fragmentation out of nothing. They are exploiting a fragmentation that already exists in modern life and making it much worse. The result is that millions of people are walking around with a collection of partial identities instead of an integrated self. They know how to perform different roles in different contexts, but they have lost touch with any core sense of who they are underneath all the performances. They are living what postmodern theorists call the condition of permanent becoming, where identity is always in flux and never settles into anything stable or satisfying. Technological determinism. Your grandmother used to memorize phone numbers, poetry, entire conversations word for word. You cannot remember what you had for breakfast without checking your camera roll. She would sit with uncomfortable emotions for hours or days until she worked through them. You reflexively grab your phone the moment you feel any psychological discomfort. She made decisions slowly after thinking them through carefully. You expect instant answers to everything and get anxious when websites take more than 3 seconds to load. Did smartphones make you this way? Or were you already becoming this way and smartphones just accelerated the process? This question keeps philosophers, cognitive scientists, and technology researchers awake at night, because the answer determines whether we have any control over our future or whether we are just passengers on a technological roller coaster that nobody is driving. And the deeper you look into this question, the more unsettling it becomes, because it reveals something most people do not want to acknowledge about how powerless we might actually be. Marshall McLuhan figured this out in the 1960s, before personal computers even existed. He said the medium is the message, which sounds like a clever slogan until you realize what he actually meant. He meant that the technology itself changes how your brain works regardless of what content you consume through that technology. It does not matter whether you use your smartphone to read Shakespeare or watch cat videos. The fact that you are getting information in rapid-fire, highly stimulating, bite-sized chunks is rewiring your neural pathways in ways that make sustained concentration nearly impossible. But here is where it gets really wild. McLuhan also said we become what we behold. Every technology extends some human capability while simultaneously amputating others. The printing press extended our memory but amputated our ability to remember things without external aids. Cars extended our mobility but amputated our leg strength and spatial awareness. Smartphones extend our access to information and social connection, but they are amputating our capacity for solitude, reflection, and deep thinking. Neuroscientist Michael Merzenich has spent decades studying neuroplasticity, and his research proves McLuhan was right about the brain changes. When you spend hours every day rapidly switching between apps and inputs, your brain literally rewires itself to crave that stimulation. The neural pathways that support sustained attention and contemplative thinking begin to atrophy. It is not that you choose to be distracted. Your brain has been physically altered to require constant stimulation to feel normal. This is not some gradual cultural shift that you can opt out of. This is biological adaptation happening whether you want it or not. Studies show that even people who consider themselves mindful technology users show measurable changes in brain structure after just a few months of regular smartphone use. The areas responsible for impulse control and emotional regulation actually shrink, while the areas associated with addiction and compulsive behavior grow stronger. And here is the really disturbing part. The people designing these technologies know exactly what they are doing to your brain. Former Google executive Tristan Harris has revealed that tech companies hire teams of neuroscientists and behavioral psychologists specifically to make their products more addictive. They use the same techniques that casinos use to keep people gambling: variable reward schedules, social approval mechanisms, fear of missing out, infinite scroll features that prevent natural stopping points. But the question remains whether this is technological determinism, where the tools shape us, or whether we are choosing to be shaped. Jacques Ellul argued that we have already crossed a line where technology has become autonomous. He said we no longer use technology to achieve human goals. Instead, we adapt human goals to fit what technology makes possible. We do not ask whether social media makes us happier or healthier. We ask how we can optimize our social media strategy. We do not question whether GPS makes us better navigators. We just accept that we are now helpless without it. This creates what Ellul called technological society, where efficiency and optimization become the highest values and human considerations become secondary. You can see this everywhere. Education gets restructured around what can be measured by standardized tests instead of what actually helps children develop as human beings. Healthcare focuses on treatments that generate data rather than approaches that support overall well-being. Even relationships get optimized through dating apps that reduce human connection to algorithmic matching. The scariest part is that once you are inside this system, it becomes almost impossible to imagine alternatives. When everyone is checking their phones constantly, someone who does not become socially isolated. When all jobs require digital skills, someone who resists technology becomes unemployable. When all social coordination happens through apps, someone who prefers face-to-face communication gets left out of everything. This is why individual solutions like digital detoxes or mindful technology use miss the point. The problem is not that some people use technology badly. The problem is that we have created a technological environment that systematically undermines human flourishing, and then we blame individuals for not being strong enough to resist it. It is like building a society around junk food and then telling people they just need more willpower to eat healthy. But recognizing technological determinism does not mean we are completely powerless. It means we need to understand that our tools are not neutral. Every technology embeds certain values and assumptions about how life should be lived. Smartphones assume that constant connectivity is desirable. Social media assumes that all human relationships can be quantified through metrics. Search engines assume that all questions have quick, definitive answers. Once you see these assumptions, you can start to make more conscious choices about which technologies to adopt and how to use them. You can design your environment to support the kind of person you want to become, instead of just accepting whatever changes happen automatically. But this requires acknowledging that the battle is not just against distraction or addiction. The battle is against technologies that are systematically rewriting the basic operating system of human consciousness. The rise of meta-narratives. Your uncle used to be a normal person who complained about traffic and worried about his mortgage. Now he spends hours every day researching how global elites are controlling the weather, manipulating the stock market, and hiding advanced technology from the public. When you try to point out inconsistencies in his theories, he does not get defensive about specific facts. Instead, he looks at you with a mixture of pity and frustration and says you just do not see the bigger picture yet. What happened to him is not stupidity or mental illness. What happened to him is that he discovered the psychological comfort of living inside a meta-narrative, and now everything else feels unbearably chaotic and meaningless. A meta-narrative is a story about stories. It is a framework that claims to explain not just individual events, but the hidden pattern that connects all events. And here is the thing that most people do not understand about conspiracy theories. They are not really about the specific conspiracies. They are about the relief of believing that someone somewhere is in control, even if that someone is evil. John Francois Lyotard predicted this would happen back in the 1970s when he wrote about the collapse of grand narratives. He said that modernity was built on big stories that gave life meaning, progress through science, freedom through democracy, salvation through religion, justice through law. But by the late 20th century, these stories were breaking down. Science created weapons of mass destruction. Democracy elected demagogues. Religion justified violence. Laws protected the wealthy and punished the poor. When these grand narratives collapsed, Lyotard thought people would learn to live with uncertainty and ambiguity. He thought we would become more tolerant of complexity and contradiction. He was completely wrong. Instead of learning to live without big explanatory stories, people became desperate to find new ones. And the internet gave them exactly what they were looking for. Conspiracy theories are perfect meta-narratives because they explain everything while requiring no institutional authority. They turn random events into meaningful patterns. They transform feelings of powerlessness into a sense of special knowledge. Most importantly, they provide certainty in a world that has become overwhelmingly uncertain. When your uncle talks about shadowy elites controlling everything, he is not just sharing information. He is sharing a complete worldview that makes sense of everything that confuses or frightens him. This is why fact-checking and debunking do not work. You cannot defeat a meta-narrative with individual facts because the meta-narrative provides a framework for interpreting all facts. Any evidence that contradicts the conspiracy becomes proof of how deep the conspiracy goes. Any expert who disputes the theory becomes part of the cover-up. The meta-narrative becomes a closed system that can absorb any new information without changing its basic structure. Cognitive scientists have studied this process and found something disturbing. When people adopt conspiracy beliefs, their brains undergo measurable changes. The areas responsible for critical thinking and probabilistic reasoning become less active, while the areas associated with pattern recognition and emotional processing become hyperactive. Essentially, the brain becomes optimized for finding connections and meaning, even when no connections exist. But here is what makes this really tragic. The psychological needs that drive people toward conspiracy theories are completely legitimate. Humans actually do need explanatory frameworks that help them make sense of complex events. We actually do need to feel like we have some understanding of the forces that shape our lives. We actually do need communities of people who share our basic assumptions about how the world works. The problem is that mainstream culture has abandoned its responsibility to provide these things. Universities teach students to deconstruct everything, but offer no replacement narratives. Media focuses on breaking news and hot takes instead of helping people understand long-term patterns. Political leaders speak in sound bites instead of coherent visions of how society should work. Religious institutions have lost credibility with large portions of the population. This creates what researchers call meaning vacuum. People are surrounded by information, but have no framework for organizing it into a coherent understanding of reality. They know something is wrong with the world, but have no legitimate way to understand what or why. Into this vacuum step conspiracy theories that offer simple explanations for complex problems and clear villains to blame for everything that feels overwhelming or unfair. The Internet amplifies this process by creating echo chambers where conspiracy believers can find thousands of other people who share their meta-narrative. Social media algorithms specifically promote content that generates strong emotional reactions, which means conspiracy theories get boosted while nuanced analysis gets buried. Within a few months, someone can go from casual skepticism to complete immersion in an alternative reality that feels more real and meaningful than the mainstream world. And once someone is fully inside a conspiracy meta-narrative, they become almost impossible to reach with conventional reasoning. They have not just changed their opinions about specific issues. They have changed their entire epistemology. They no longer trust the same sources of information or use the same methods of evaluating evidence. They are literally living in a different reality than people who still operate within mainstream frameworks. This is why conspiracy theories spread so rapidly during times of social upheaval, when existing institutions lose credibility and traditional narratives break down. People become desperate for new stories that explain what is happening and why. Conspiracy theories fill that gap by providing comprehensive explanations that feel more satisfying than the messy, incomplete accounts offered by mainstream sources. The really disturbing part is that conspiracy theorists are often right about one thing. There really are powerful people making decisions that affect millions of lives without transparency or accountability. There really are systems of power that operate in ways that benefit elites at the expense of ordinary people. There really are cover-ups and lies and manipulation happening at high levels of government and business. The problem is not that conspiracy theorists are imagining problems that do not exist. The problem is that they are creating fictional explanations for real problems, and then becoming so attached to those explanations that they cannot engage with actual solutions. Globalization and cultural erasure. A walk through any major city in the world, and you will see the same stores selling the same products to people wearing the same brands while staring at the same apps on identical smartphones. McDonald's in Tokyo serves the same fries as McDonald's in Sao Paulo. Starbucks in Istanbul plays the same background music as Starbucks in Detroit. H&M in Mumbai sells clothes designed in Sweden, manufactured in Bangladesh, marketed through the same Instagram campaigns that target teenagers in every country simultaneously. Your great-grandmother lived in a world where food, music, clothing, architecture, and social customs changed dramatically every few hundred miles. You live in a world where you can fly to the opposite side of the planet and find people living almost exactly like you do. This is not just convenience or progress. This is the systematic replacement of local cultures with a single global monoculture, and most people have no idea how much they have lost in the process. Anthropologists call this process cultural homogenization, but that sterile academic term does not capture what it actually feels like to watch the unique ways of life that took centuries to develop get steamrolled by global capitalism in just a few decades. Languages that contain irreplaceable knowledge about local ecosystems disappear when their speakers switch to English for economic opportunities. Traditional crafts that represent thousands of years of accumulated wisdom get abandoned when mass-produced alternatives become cheaper and more convenient. But here is what makes this really heartbreaking. The people making these choices are not stupid or selfish. They are making rational decisions within a system that punishes cultural distinctiveness and rewards conformity to global standards. If you are a young person in a small town, your traditional culture cannot offer you the same economic opportunities as moving to a big city and learning to navigate international business culture. If you are a parent, you want your children to speak the languages and develop the skills that will help them succeed in a globalized economy, even if that means they lose connection to their ancestral heritage. This creates what sociologists call the modernization trap. Every step toward economic development requires abandoning something distinctive about your local culture. Every generation becomes a little more generic, a little more interchangeable with people everywhere else. Within a few decades, communities that had unique identities for thousands of years start looking and acting like suburbs of the same global metropolis. Roland Robertson studied this process and found something disturbing. Globalization does not just spread Western culture to other parts of the world. It creates a new hybrid culture that is not really from anywhere. The global elite, whether they live in New York or London or Singapore or Dubai, all consume the same media, attend the same universities, wear the same luxury brands, and hold the same basic assumptions about how life should be lived. They have more in common with each other than they do with people from their own countries who have not entered the global system. Meanwhile, the people left behind in local communities experience what researchers call cultural vertigo. Their traditional ways of making sense of the world no longer match the reality they face every day. The skills and knowledge that their parents and grandparents valued become irrelevant. The social institutions that used to provide stability and meaning either disappear entirely or become hollow performances maintained mostly for tourists. This is why populist movements have erupted all over the world at the same time. People are not just angry about economic inequality or political corruption. They are angry about cultural displacement. They feel like strangers in places their families have lived for generations. They watch their children adopt values and lifestyles that have nothing to do with their inherited traditions. They see their local businesses replaced by international chains and their main streets turned into generic shopping districts that could be anywhere. But here is where it gets really complicated. Many of the traditional cultures that are disappearing were themselves products of earlier waves of cultural mixing and change. The idea of pure, authentic local culture is often a romantic fiction. Most of what we think of as traditional food, music, and customs actually developed through centuries of trade, migration, and cultural exchange. The curry that defines Indian cuisine includes chilies from the Americas. The tomatoes that are essential to Italian cooking came from Mexico. The acoustic guitars that define flamenco music originated in the Middle East. So when people talk about preserving authentic culture, they are often trying to freeze a particular moment in an ongoing process of cultural evolution. But that does not make their feelings of loss any less real or valid. Even if cultures have always changed, the speed and scale of change today is unprecedented. Previous generations had time to adapt and integrate new influences gradually. Now entire ways of life can be transformed within a single generation. The psychological impact of this rapid cultural change is something that mental health researchers are just beginning to understand. When people lose connection to cultural traditions that gave their ancestors meaning and identity, they do not just lose customs and practices. They lose what psychologists call cultural scaffolding. These are the invisible frameworks that help people understand who they are, where they belong, and how they should live. Without cultural scaffolding, people become vulnerable to what Zygmunt Bauman called liquid modernity. Everything solid melts into air. Nothing feels permanent or reliable. People have more freedom than ever before to choose their own identities and lifestyles, but they also have less guidance about how to make those choices in ways that will lead to fulfillment and meaning. This is not an argument for turning back the clock or rejecting all aspects of globalization. Many local traditions were oppressive or harmful, and many people have found freedom and opportunity through access to global culture. But it is an argument for recognizing what we are losing and thinking more carefully about whether the benefits of cultural homogenization are worth the costs. The real tragedy is that we are conducting a massive experiment on human civilization without really understanding what the results might be. For the first time in history, we are creating a world where most people have no deep connection to place, culture, or tradition. We are finding out what happens when humans try to live without roots. The aestheticization of politics. Walter Benjamin warned us in 1935 that fascism seeks to give political life an aesthetic form, transforming politics into spectacle rather than substance. Nearly a century later, his prophecy has materialized in ways he could never have imagined. We live in an era where political success is measured not by policy outcomes, but by viral moments, where governance has been replaced by performance, and where the line between politician and influencer has completely dissolved. The aestheticization of politics represents one of the most profound shifts in how power operates in the 21st century. It's not simply that politicians use social media. It's that the medium has fundamentally altered the message, transforming democratic discourse into an endless stream of curated content designed for maximum engagement rather than meaningful debate. Guy Debord's concept of the society of the spectacle has found its ultimate expression in contemporary politics. Political reality is increasingly constructed through carefully orchestrated visual narratives rather than actual policy implementation. Consider Donald Trump's presidency, which functioned as a masterclass in political aestheticization. His administration understood that governing through Twitter wasn't just about communication, it was about creating a perpetual state of manufactured crisis and resolution that kept audiences addicted to the political drama. Trump's genius wasn't in traditional politics, but in recognizing that politics had become indistinguishable from entertainment. His rallies weren't policy forums, but carefully choreographed spectacles, complete with entrance music, dramatic lighting, and call and response chants that wouldn't be out of place at a rock concert. The red MAGA hat became more than political merchandise. It became a lifestyle brand, transforming political allegiance into a form of aesthetic identity. But this phenomenon extends far beyond Trump. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez revolutionized political communication by treating Instagram stories like a reality TV show, giving followers behind the scenes access to congressional life while making complex policy issues digestible through the visual language of social media. Her cooking videos while discussing Medicare for all weren't just clever communication, they represented a fundamental shift toward making politics feel intimate and accessible through aesthetic means. The traditional politician spoke from podiums to crowds. The contemporary politician performs authenticity for cameras, understanding that political power now flows through algorithmic distribution rather than institutional channels. This shift has created what we might call the influencer-politician complex, a new form of political actor who understands that virality equals visibility and visibility equals viability. Volodymyr Zelensky's transformation from comedian to wartime president illustrates this evolution perfectly. His background in entertainment wasn't a liability, but an asset, providing him with the performance skills necessary to navigate modern political communication. His ability to communicate Ukraine's struggle through compelling visual narratives, the green military T-shirt, the bunker selfies, the carefully framed video addresses demonstrates how contemporary political leadership requires mastery of aesthetic presentation as much as policy expertise. Similarly, figures like Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau built their political brands around carefully curated visual identities. Trudeau's colorful socks, his yoga poses, his perfectly timed photo opportunities weren't accidents, they were strategic aesthetic choices, designed to communicate values and personality through image rather than policy papers. When Trudeau appeared on the cover of Rolling Stone, it wasn't political news coverage, it was lifestyle branding. The architecture of political aesthetics, social media platforms have become the primary spaces where political aesthetics are constructed and consumed. Each platform demands its own visual language. Instagram's carefully curated squares favor polished, aspirational content. TikTok's vertical videos reward authenticity and relatability. Twitter's text-based format privileges wit and controversy. Politicians who succeed understand these distinct aesthetic requirements and tailor their content accordingly. The result is the emergence of what John Baudrillard would recognize as political simulacra, political representations that have become more real than the political reality they supposedly represent. When politicians spend more time crafting their social media presence than crafting legislation, the simulation becomes the reality. Policy positions become secondary to aesthetic positioning. Consider how political scandals now unfold. Traditional political scandals involved corruption, abuse of power, or policy failures. Contemporary political scandals often center on aesthetic missteps, inappropriate outfits, unflattering photographs, or poorly timed social media posts. The substance of governance becomes less important than the style of its presentation. This aestheticization creates what appears to be a more democratic form of political engagement. Social media platforms theoretically give everyone equal access to political discourse, breaking down traditional barriers between politicians and constituents. Political figures can speak directly to their audiences without media intermediation, creating the illusion of authentic, unfiltered communication. However, This apparent democratization masks new forms of exclusion and manipulation. The algorithms that determine which political content gets seen are opaque and commercially driven, not democratically accountable. The politicians who succeed are those who best understand how to game these systems, not necessarily those with the best ideas or most experience. The aesthetic demands of social media also favor certain types of political messages over others. Complex policy discussions don't translate well to Instagram stories or TikTok videos. Visual media rewards emotional appeals over rational argument, personality over policy, and controversy over consensus. The medium shapes the message in ways that fundamentally alter the nature of political discourse. The aestheticization of politics creates what we might call the postmodern political subject, citizens whose political identities are increasingly constructed through consumption of political aesthetics rather than engagement with political substance. Political affiliation becomes a form of lifestyle choice, expressed through the consumption of political content, merchandise, and experiences. This shift explains the rise of political tourism, from Trump rallies to women's marches, where political engagement becomes indistinguishable from entertainment consumption. Participants aren't just advocating for policies, they're purchasing experiences, creating social media content, and participating in aesthetic communities that reinforce their political identities. The danger isn't that politics has become aesthetic, but that aesthetic considerations have begun to replace substantive political evaluation. When political success is measured by follower counts, engagement rates, and viral moments rather than policy outcomes, the entire framework for democratic accountability shifts. The aestheticization of politics represents more than a change in communication style. It signals a fundamental transformation in how power operates in postmodern societies. When politics becomes indistinguishable from entertainment, when governance becomes performance, and when democratic participation becomes content consumption, we must ask whether we're witnessing the evolution of democracy or its dissolution. The challenge isn't to reject the visual dimension of politics. That's neither possible nor desirable in our media-saturated age. Instead, we must develop new forms of critical literacy that can distinguish between aesthetic appeal and substantive value, between compelling performance and effective governance. We need to understand how the aestheticization of politics shapes our democratic possibilities while working to ensure that spectacle serves, rather than replaces democratic substance. The politicians have become influencers, but the question remains, what are they influencing us toward? The answer will determine whether the aestheticization of politics represents democracy's adaptation to the digital age or its final transformation into something else entirely. Rhizomatic Thinking. In 1980, philosophers Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari introduced a radical metaphor that would reshape how we understand knowledge: the rhizome. Unlike trees, which grow hierarchically from root to trunk to branches, rhizomes spread underground in unpredictable directions, connecting, branching, and multiplying without central control. 40 years later, this concept has become essential to understanding our algorithmic world. The rhizomatic model challenges everything we've been taught about knowledge organization, where traditional Western thought operates through hierarchies and linear progression. Rhizomatic thinking embraces multiplicity, connection, and radical openness. It mirrors how ideas actually spread in our hyper-connected world, not through institutional gatekeepers, but through viral transmission, unexpected associations, and emergent patterns that no authority can control. For centuries, knowledge was organized like a tree. Universities divided learning into distinct branches: physics separate from poetry, history isolated from biology. Information flowed downward from authorities to students, from experts to publics. This created clear hierarchies. Some knowledge was higher, some voices more authoritative, some connections legitimate, while others were dismissed as irrelevant. The digital revolution shattered this tree structure. Wikipedia demonstrates rhizomatic knowledge in action. Articles connect through hyperlinks that create infinite pathways of exploration. There's no single correct way to navigate from quantum mechanics to medieval literature to contemporary art. Every reader creates their own unique journey through the network, following connections that make sense only to them. Search engines embody rhizomatic principles perfectly. When you type a query into Google, you're activating a massive network that connects your search terms to billions of data points in ways no human librarian could anticipate. The PageRank algorithm doesn't evaluate pages based on hierarchical authority, but on network connections, how many other pages link to them, and how important those connecting pages are. YouTube's recommendation algorithm demonstrates rhizomatic thinking in real time. The platform doesn't organize content hierarchically, but creates dynamic pathways based on viewing patterns and engagement metrics. A video about car repair might lead to motorcycle maintenance, then philosophical discussions about technology, then survivalist content, then political commentary. These connections reflect actual patterns of human curiosity that no traditional educational system would have predicted. Social media platforms have created vast rhizomatic networks where any information can connect to any other. A TikTok video about sourdough bread connects to discussions of industrial agriculture, which link to climate change activism, which connect to indigenous knowledge systems. These connections aren't planned by authorities. They emerge organically through user engagement and algorithmic amplification. Rhizomatic thinking helps us understand how memes spread. Richard Dawkins' concept of memes, self-replicating cultural information, operates according to rhizomatic principles. Memes don't spread hierarchically through institutional channels, but proliferate through network connections and mutation. A joke format emerges on one platform, gets remixed on another, combines with political commentary on a third, and eventually influences mainstream media. The QAnon conspiracy theory provides a dark example of rhizomatic knowledge production. The movement succeeded by creating a participatory mythology where believers could make their own connections between disparate information. Followers weren't passive consumers, but active producers, generating endless variations that no central authority orchestrated. The movement's strength came from its rhizomatic structure. When one node was removed, the network simply grew new connections around the gap. Rhizomatic thinking explains why crowdsourced knowledge often outperforms expert judgment. Stock markets aggregate information through millions of individual decisions rather than central planning. Open source software development relies on distributed collaboration rather than hierarchical management. Linux succeeded because it created a network structure that allowed thousands of contributors to connect their efforts productively. Activism demonstrates rhizomatic organizing. #MeToo, Black Lives Matter, and #ClimateStrike succeeded through rhizomatic spreading individuals, making personal connections to shared experiences, creating new nodes in expanding networks of awareness and action. These movements had no central command structure, but generated coordinated action through distributed intelligence. However, rhizomatic networks enable new forms of control. Platform algorithms may appear to offer unlimited connections, but they actually channel user behavior through invisible parameters. Facebook's algorithm doesn't simply show users what they want to see, it trains users to want what generates the most engagement for the platform. The rhizomatic appearance of infinite choice conceals a narrowing of actual possibilities. China's social credit system represents the ultimate algorithmic capture of rhizomatic networks. The system monitors all connections, who you associate with, what you buy, where you go, what you post, and uses this network analysis to generate behavioral predictions and social control. The rhizomatic principle of infinite connectivity becomes a tool for unprecedented surveillance. The challenge isn't to reject rhizomatic thinking, but to develop new literacies for navigating non-linear knowledge networks. We need to understand how algorithms shape the connections we perceive as natural, how network effects can amplify both wisdom and delusion, and how to maintain critical thinking within systems designed to optimize for engagement rather than truth. Understanding rhizomatic thinking means recognizing that knowledge networks operate according to different principles than we were taught. In our algorithmic world, thinking rhizomatically isn't just an intellectual exercise, it's a survival skill for navigating a reality that operates according to network logic rather than hierarchical control. Hauntology. Jacques Derrida coined the term hauntology in 1993, playing on the word ontology, the philosophical study of being and existence. But where ontology asks what exists, hauntology asks what haunts. Examining the spectral presence of things that never quite materialized, futures that were promised but never delivered, and past possibilities that continue to linger in our collective imagination like ghosts refusing to be laid to rest. In our contemporary moment, hauntology has become the dominant cultural mood. We live surrounded by the phantoms of abandoned futures, the space colonies we were promised by 2000, the flying cars that never arrived, the robot servants that would free us from labor, the paperless offices that would streamline our work lives. These unfulfilled promises don't simply disappear. They haunt our present, creating a sense of temporal displacement where we feel simultaneously stuck in the past and cut off from any coherent vision of the future. Consider the aesthetic landscape of the early 21st century. Our popular culture is dominated by remakes, reboots, and nostalgic revivals. Stranger Things mines 1980s aesthetics, Marvel resurrects comic book heroes from decades past, and musicians like The Weeknd craft songs that sound like they were recorded in 1985. This isn't mere nostalgia, it's a hauntological condition where the past refuses to stay buried, and the future seems to have been canceled. The music industry exemplifies this hauntological crisis. Streaming algorithms increasingly favor music that sounds familiar, creating what critic Simon Reynolds calls retromania, an endless recycling of past sounds and styles. New artists achieve success by perfecting imitations of previous decades rather than pioneering genuinely novel forms. The result is a cultural landscape where the past becomes more vivid and present than the actual present, while the future appears as nothing more than an endless repetition of styles already exhausted. Technology companies have become the primary manufacturers of hauntological experiences. Silicon Valley continuously promises revolutionary futures, artificial general intelligence, virtual reality worlds, autonomous vehicles, the metaverse, while simultaneously trapping us in addictive feedback loops that prevent genuine temporal progress. We're offered virtual realities as substitutes for the social and economic transformations that technology was supposed to enable. The future arrives as simulation rather than actualization. The concept of capitalist realism, developed by critic Mark Fisher, provides crucial context for understanding our hauntological predicament. Fisher argued that capitalism has achieved total ideological dominance not through active propaganda, but through the elimination of alternatives. When Margaret Thatcher declared, "There is no alternative," she wasn't just describing economic policy, but announcing the death of futurity itself. If capitalism represents the end of history, then the future can only be more of the same, more commodification, more inequality, more environmental destruction. This temporal stasis manifests in what Fisher called chronic dysphoria, a collective depression born from the realization that the promised future has been indefinitely postponed. Young people face a world where previous generations' achievements seem unrepeachable. Home ownership, stable employment, and social mobility appear as artifacts from a vanished era rather than attainable goals. The American dream doesn't die, it becomes a ghost that haunts contemporary life precisely through its absence. Social media amplifies hauntological experiences by creating an endless present where all temporal moments collapse into a single feed. Past events, current happenings, and future speculations blend together in an undifferentiated stream of content. The algorithm doesn't distinguish between yesterday's news and today's trends. Everything becomes equally present and equally distant. We lose the ability to experience genuine temporal progression, trapped instead in what Frederick Jameson called perpetual present. The climate crisis represents perhaps the most profound hauntological phenomenon of our time. We know with scientific certainty that our current trajectory leads to civilizational collapse, yet we seem collectively unable to change course. The future appears simultaneously inevitable and impossible. We can see it coming but cannot prevent it. This creates a unique temporal experience where catastrophe haunts the present not as possibility, but as foregone conclusion. Political movements across the spectrum reflect this hauntological condition. Progressive politics often centers on returning to New Deal social democracy rather than imagining genuinely new forms of organization. Conservative politics explicitly promises to restore a mythologized past. Revolutionary alternatives seem not just unlikely, but literally unimaginable. The future has been so thoroughly colonized by capitalist logic that even utopian thinking appears naive. The COVID-19 pandemic crystallized our hauntological moment. The crisis briefly opened space for imagining radical alternatives, universal basic income, massive public investment, fundamental changes to work and social organization. Yet as the acute phase ended, these possibilities were quickly abandoned in favor of returning to normal. The future that briefly appeared possible became another ghost haunting our collective imagination. Understanding hauntology doesn't mean surrendering to temporal paralysis. Rather, it means recognizing that genuine futurity requires actively confronting the ghosts that prevent temporal progression. We must acknowledge the hold that abandoned futures maintain over our imagination while simultaneously working to clear space for genuinely new possibilities. The task isn't to ignore these spectral presences, but to engage them critically. What did those unrealized futures promise that still resonates? What aspects should be preserved and what should be abandoned? How might we imagine futures that aren't simply repetitions of past dreams, but genuine alternatives to our current trajectory? Hauntology reveals that we're living through a crisis of temporal imagination, unable to move forward because we remain possessed by the ghosts of futures that never arrived. Moral relativism. When Friedrich Nietzsche declared, "God is dead," he wasn't celebrating atheism but warning of a crisis that would define modernity if absolute moral authority disappears. What happens to ethics itself? This question has become urgently relevant in our postmodern world, where moral relativism has evolved from a philosophical position into the default cultural stance. We live in an era where "that's just your opinion" has become the ultimate conversation stopper, where moral claims are treated as mere preferences, and where the very possibility of ethical truth seems to have vanished. Moral relativism argues that ethical judgments are not objectively true or false, but relative to particular cultures, societies, or individuals. What counts as right or wrong depends entirely on context. There are no universal moral facts, only local customs and personal beliefs. This position gained intellectual respectability through anthropological discoveries that revealed the vast diversity of human moral systems. If some cultures practice polygamy, while others enforce monogamy, if some societies value individual achievement, while others prioritize collective harmony, how can we claim that any particular moral framework represents universal truth? The appeal of moral relativism is obvious in our globalized, multicultural world. It promises tolerance, humility, and respect for difference, rather than imposing Western values on other cultures or claiming privileged access to moral truth. Relativism suggests we should simply accept that different societies have developed different, but equally valid approaches to ethical life. This seems both intellectually honest and politically progressive, a way of avoiding the arrogance and imperialism that have historically accompanied claims to moral certainty. Social media has accelerated the triumph of relativistic thinking by creating echo chambers where every moral position can find validation and support. Online communities form around shared values, creating the impression that morality is simply a matter of finding your tribe rather than discovering universal principles. The algorithm doesn't distinguish between well-reasoned ethical arguments and popular opinions. Whatever generates engagement gets amplified, regardless of its moral validity. Cancel culture represents both the triumph and the crisis of moral relativism. On one hand, it reflects relativistic principles by rejecting traditional moral authorities and allowing previously marginalized voices to define their own ethical standards. On the other hand, it reveals the practical impossibility of pure relativism by enforcing new moral orthodoxies with the same fervor as any absolute system. The very intensity of contemporary moral conflicts suggests that people don't really believe ethics are merely relative. They act as if their moral positions reflect genuine truths worth fighting for. Corporate culture has weaponized moral relativism for commercial purposes. Companies now position themselves as ethical brands while avoiding any substantive commitment to universal principles. They celebrate diversity and inclusion in their marketing while maintaining supply chains that rely on exploitative labor practices. This corporate relativism suggests that ethics are simply another form of branding, a way of appealing to target demographics, rather than genuine commitment to moral principles. The climate crisis exposes the practical limitations of moral relativism. If ethical obligations are purely relative to local cultures and immediate interests, then we have no basis for criticizing societies or individuals who prioritize short-term economic gains over long-term environmental sustainability. Pure relativism, would suggest that future generations have no legitimate claim on present behavior, since moral obligations don't extend beyond particular communities and time periods. Yet moral relativism faces serious philosophical challenges that its popularity cannot resolve. The relativist position is self-defeating. If all moral claims are merely relative, then moral relativism itself is merely relative and has no claim to universal validity. Why should anyone accept relativism rather than absolutism if both are equally arbitrary cultural constructions? The relativist cannot coherently argue for tolerance without implicitly appealing to universal principles that transcend particular cultural contexts. More practically, moral relativism makes ethical criticism impossible. If moral judgments are purely relative, then we cannot coherently condemn practices like genocide, slavery, or oppression when they occur in cultures that approve of them. The relativist who wants to criticize these practices must either abandon relativism or accept that their criticism has no rational basis beyond personal preference. The psychological evidence suggests that humans are not natural relativists. Children develop moral intuitions about fairness, harm, and justice that appear to transcend cultural boundaries. Research in moral psychology reveals that people across cultures share certain fundamental ethical concerns, even when they disagree about specific applications. This suggests that moral relativism may be more of an intellectual position than a reflection of how humans actually experience ethical life. Perhaps the real question is not whether objective moral truth exists, but whether ethics can function without some shared foundation. Even if ultimate moral truth remains elusive, ethical discourse requires common ground, shared procedures for reasoning about moral questions, mutual recognition of certain basic human needs and vulnerabilities, and agreement that some forms of justification are better than others. The alternative to both naive absolutism and nihilistic relativism might be what philosopher J.U. Rajan Habermas calls discourse ethics, the idea that moral validity emerges through genuine dialogue where all affected parties can participate as equals. This approach acknowledges cultural diversity while maintaining that ethical claims can be rationally evaluated through inclusive conversation and debate. Moral relativism promises tolerance but delivers nihilism. Ethics can survive without absolute certainty, but it cannot survive the complete abandonment of any aspiration to truth. The challenge is developing forms of moral reasoning that remain open to revision, while providing sufficient foundation for meaningful ethical life. Moral relativism. When Friedrich Nietzsche declared, "God is dead," he wasn't celebrating atheism but warning of a crisis that would define modernity if absolute moral authority disappears. What happens to ethics itself? This question has become urgently relevant in our postmodern world, where moral relativism has evolved from a philosophical position into the default cultural stance. We live in an era where "that's just your opinion" has become the ultimate conversation stopper, where moral claims are treated as mere preferences, and where the very possibility of ethical truth seems to have vanished. Moral relativism argues that ethical judgments are not objectively true or false, but relative to particular cultures, societies, or individuals. What counts as right or wrong depends entirely on context. There are no universal moral facts, only local customs and personal beliefs. This position gained intellectual respectability through anthropological discoveries that revealed the vast diversity of human moral systems. If some cultures practice polygamy, while others enforce monogamy, if some societies value individual achievement, while others prioritize collective harmony, How can we claim that any particular moral framework represents universal truth? The appeal of moral relativism is obvious in our globalized, multicultural world. It promises tolerance, humility, and respect for difference, rather than imposing Western values on other cultures or claiming privileged access to moral truth. Relativism suggests we should simply accept that different societies have developed different, but equally valid approaches to ethical life. This seems both intellectually honest and politically progressive, a way of avoiding the arrogance and imperialism that have historically accompanied claims to moral certainty. Social media has accelerated the triumph of relativistic thinking by creating echo chambers where every moral position can find validation and support. Online communities form around shared values, creating the impression that morality is simply a matter of finding your tribe rather than discovering universal principles. The algorithm doesn't distinguish between well-reasoned ethical arguments and popular opinions. Whatever generates engagement gets amplified, regardless of its moral validity. Cancel culture represents both the triumph and the crisis of moral relativism. On one hand, it reflects relativistic principles by rejecting traditional moral authorities and allowing previously marginalized voices to define their own ethical standards. On the other hand, it reveals the practical impossibility of pure relativism by enforcing new moral orthodoxies with the same fervor as any absolute system. The very intensity of contemporary moral conflicts suggests that people don't really believe ethics are merely relative. They act as if their moral positions reflect genuine truths worth fighting for. Corporate culture has weaponized moral relativism for commercial purposes. Companies now position themselves as ethical brands while avoiding any substantive commitment to universal principles. They celebrate diversity and inclusion in their marketing while maintaining supply chains that rely on exploitative labor practices. This corporate relativism suggests that ethics are simply another form of branding, a way of appealing to target demographics, rather than genuine commitment to moral principles. The climate crisis exposes the practical limitations of moral relativism. If ethical obligations are purely relative to local cultures and immediate interests, then we have no basis for criticizing societies or individuals who prioritize short-term economic gains over long-term environmental sustainability. Pure relativism would suggest that future generations have no legitimate claim on present behavior, since moral obligations don't extend beyond particular communities and time periods. Yet moral relativism faces serious philosophical challenges that its popularity cannot resolve. The relativist position is self-defeating. If all moral claims are merely relative, then moral relativism itself is merely relative and has no claim to universal validity. Why should anyone accept relativism rather than absolutism if both are equally arbitrary cultural constructions? The relativist cannot coherently argue for tolerance without implicitly appealing to universal principles that transcend particular cultural contexts. More practically, moral relativism makes ethical criticism impossible. If moral judgments are purely relative, then we cannot coherently condemn practices like genocide, slavery, or oppression when they occur in cultures that approve of them. The relativist who wants to criticize these practices must either abandon relativism or accept that their criticism has no rational basis beyond personal preference. The psychological evidence suggests that humans are not natural relativists. Children develop moral intuitions about fairness, harm, and justice that appear to transcend cultural boundaries. Research in moral psychology reveals that people across cultures share certain fundamental ethical concerns, even when they disagree about specific applications. This suggests that moral relativism may be more of an intellectual position than a reflection of how humans actually experience ethical life. Perhaps the real question is not whether objective moral truth exists, but whether ethics can function without some shared foundation. Even if ultimate moral truth remains elusive, ethical discourse requires common ground, shared procedures for reasoning about moral questions, mutual recognition of certain basic human needs and vulnerabilities, and agreement that some forms of justification are better than others. The alternative to both naive absolutism and nihilistic relativism might be what philosopher J.U. Rajan Habermas calls discourse ethics, the idea that moral validity emerges through genuine dialogue where all affected parties can participate as equals. This approach acknowledges cultural diversity while maintaining that ethical claims can be rationally evaluated through inclusive conversation and debate. Moral relativism promises tolerance but delivers nihilism. Ethics can survive without absolute certainty, but it cannot survive the complete abandonment of any aspiration to truth. The challenge is developing forms of moral reasoning that remain open to revision, while providing sufficient foundation for meaningful ethical life.